By the opening decades of the 5th century, Roman Britain remained outwardly familiar, town walls still stood, roads still connected former administrative centers, and villas continued to dot the countryside, but the systems that sustained imperial rule were no longer functioning. Authority had not collapsed suddenly. It had thinned, retreated, and finally ceased to operate. What remained was not a province in revolt, but one increasingly left to govern itself without imperial direction. The traditional marker for the end of Roman rule in Britain is the rescript attributed to Emperor Honorius around 410 CE, in which British communities were instructed to see to their own defense. Although the precise wording and context of this communication are debated, contemporary sources such as Zosimus indicate that imperial military support was no longer forthcoming. This withdrawal reflected broader pressures on the Western Roman Empire, particularly the need to defend Italy and Gaul against internal usurpations and external invasions. Britain's separation was therefore a strategic consequence of imperial contraction rather than a localized political decision. Archaeological evidence supports this interpretation of administrative disengagement rather than catastrophic collapse. Coin circulation in Britain declines sharply after the final issues of the House of Theodosius in the early 5th century, indicating the breakdown of centralized taxation and pay systems. Coin hoards from this period, often buried and never recovered, suggest economic uncertainty and the absence of functioning monetary exchange. Without regular imperial payments, the structures that bound soldiers, administrators, and civilians into a provincial system could no longer be sustained. Urban centers, once the backbone of Roman administration, also show signs of gradual abandonment. Excavations at towns such as Verulamium and Silchester revealed declining maintenance of public buildings, reduced waste management, and the repurposing of civic spaces for domestic or industrial use. These changes occurred unevenly and over several decades, indicating local adaptation rather than uniform destruction. In some areas, particularly in Western Britain, urban life persisted longer, while in others the functions of towns diminished rapidly as rural estates became more central to economic life. The fate of Roman villas further illustrates this uneven transition. Many villa complexes ceased operation in the early 5th century, as seen through the abandonment of hypocaust systems and the decline of high-quality imported goods. Others, however, continued in modified forms, sometimes occupied by smaller communities or adapted for agricultural production. Archaeologists uncovered evidence at sites such as Wroxeter showing large-scale timber construction within former Roman civic spaces, suggesting continuity of population even as building techniques and social organization changed. Written sources from the period are sparse and often retrospective. Gildas, writing in the 6th century, provides a moralized account of Britain's abandonment by Rome, describing civil disorder and external threats. While his narrative must be treated cautiously, it aligns with archaeological indicators of political fragmentation and localized authority. Importantly, no contemporary evidence points to the immediate replacement of Roman governance with a unified successor regime. Instead, power appears to have devolved to regional leaders, possibly former Roman officials or local elites who adapted imperial practices to new circumstances. This fragmentation reveals a key structural transition. Roman Britain depended on centralized coordination, taxation, military logistics, and bureaucratic oversight that could not function once imperial connections dissolved. Without these systems, political authority became personal and territorial rather than institutional. Control rested on access to land, manpower, and defensive capability, not on formal office within an imperial hierarchy. This shift did not erase Roman cultural influence, but it fundamentally altered how power operated. Continuity and rupture coexisted during this period. Latin literacy persisted in some ecclesiastical and administrative contexts, and elements of Roman law and land division likely influenced local governance. At the same time, long-distance trade networks collapsed, standardized production declined, and Britain became increasingly isolated from Mediterranean economic systems. Archaeological layers from the early 5th century show a marked reduction in imported ceramics and luxury goods, underscoring Britain's separation from imperial supply chains. The absence of a unified successor state had lasting consequences. Unlike Gaul or Hispania, Where post-Roman kingdoms emerged relatively quickly, Britain entered a prolonged phase of political decentralization. This created conditions in which external groups, initially as mercenaries, later as settlers, could exert increasing influence. The lack of centralized military organization made coordinated defense difficult, particularly along the eastern and southern coasts. By the middle of the 5th century, Roman Britain no longer functioned as a province, but neither had it descended into immediate anarchy. Instead, it existed as a patchwork of regional authorities operating within the remnants of imperial infrastructure. Governance had shifted from bureaucratic administration to localized rule, setting the structural conditions for the cultural and political transformations that followed. As Roman systems receded from daily life, new populations and political forms began to occupy the space left behind, reshaping the island's future in enduring ways. Before we continue, you may choose to subscribe to the channel and enable notifications for future Nightfall history documentaries. If a particular section stands out to you, feel free to note it in the comments. Your engagement supports the continued production of long-form, research-driven historical narratives. In the centuries after Rome, new communities reshaped Britain through settlement rather than empire. Following the withdrawal of Roman authority, Britain entered a period of demographic and cultural flux. The early 5th century saw the gradual arrival of Germanic-speaking groups, commonly identified as Angles, Saxons, and Jutes. Contemporary textual sources, including Gildas's De Excidio et Conquesta Britanniae and Bede's Ecclesiastical History of the English People, offer retrospective accounts of these migrations, but archaeological evidence provides the primary basis for reconstructing settlement patterns and social integration. Material culture, burial practices, and place name studies indicate that the transformation of Britain was uneven, occurring regionally over decades rather than through rapid or uniform conquest. Excavations at cemeteries such as Spong Hill in Norfolk, one of the largest early Anglo-Saxon burial sites, reveal a complex pattern of inhumation and cremation, often accompanied by grave goods including jewelry, weaponry, and ceramics. These findings suggest both continuity and change. While some funerary customs echo late Roman practices, others reflect distinct Germanic traditions. The variability in burial rites indicates that communities adapted their cultural repertoire locally, integrating immigrant and indigenous elements over time. Settlement evidence corroborates these patterns of gradual transformation. Archaeologists have identified dispersed farmsteads and nucleated villages, often located near former Roman roads or along river valleys, which facilitated continuity of trade and communication. Sites such as the post-Roman adaptation of Roman villa estates demonstrate that some Roman infrastructure was repurposed rather than abandoned entirely. Similarly, patterns of timber construction, hearth placement, and enclosure planning illustrate evolving approaches to domestic and agricultural organization, which supported growing populations and emerging local leadership. Linguistic shifts provide additional evidence of Anglo-Saxon settlement. Old English began to emerge across eastern and southern Britain, replacing Latin and Brittonic vernaculars in administrative and everyday contexts. Place names with elements such as ham, tun, and berry correspond with areas of intensive settlement and suggest systematic colonization patterns. These toponymic distributions align closely with archaeological findings, indicating that the cultural transformation encompassed language, governance, and land use. The material evidence from elite sites, most notably Sutton Hoo in Suffolk, illustrates the formation of nascent polities. The burial of high-status individuals with weapons, imported goods, and ceremonial artifacts demonstrates both social stratification and connections to wider North Sea networks. This elite visibility points to the emergence of leadership hierarchies capable of exercising control over defined territories. Importantly, such sites also indicate continuity of trade, craft production, and maritime interaction, suggesting that these new communities were integrated into broader economic systems rather than isolated insular groups. Interpretive analysis reveals several structural developments. First, settlement patterns demonstrate that the Anglo-Saxon transformation relied on localized adaptation rather than wholesale population replacement. Second, The integration of Roman infrastructure and indigenous populations facilitated the continuity of administrative and economic systems, laying the groundwork for early English polities. Third, the combination of material culture, linguistic change, and elite representation underscores the gradual emergence of territorial authority, which would become the foundation for later kingdoms such as Wessex, Mercia, and Kent. Archaeological stratigraphy and radiocarbon dating support a timeline of settlement extending across the 5th and early 6th centuries. Evidence suggests that initial migrations concentrated in eastern coastal regions before radiating inland, reflecting both navigational accessibility and strategic occupation of fertile land. This process coincided with regional defensive adaptations, including the reuse of hill forts and the creation of small-scale fortified homesteads, indicating a growing concern with territorial control and intergroup conflict. By integrating textual sources, material evidence, and environmental data, a clear picture emerges. The Anglo-Saxon transition was a systemic process characterized by demographic influx, cultural adaptation, and localized political organization. These early communities established social hierarchies, economic networks, and linguistic frameworks that persisted and evolved, providing the structural conditions for the consolidation of early medieval kingdoms. From these settlements arose the first durable political structures in early medieval England. Localized authority, reinforced by lineage, landholding, and emerging governance mechanisms, laid the foundation for regional kingdoms that would define the next phase of English history. By mid-6th century, Britain was no longer a post-Roman province. It had become a landscape of evolving polities, interconnected through trade, culture, and shared adaptation to the legacy of the Roman past. By the 6th century, England existed not as a nation, but as a mosaic of rival kingdoms. Following decades of settlement and cultural adaptation, the eastern and southern regions of Britain saw the emergence of identifiable early kingdoms. Archaeological and textual evidence points to the establishment of Kent, Wessex, and Mercia as distinct polities with territorial control, hereditary leadership, and nascent administrative structures. Governance in these kingdoms relied on kinship networks, the allocation of land for service, and mechanisms for dispute resolution. This framework enabled leaders to exert authority over local populations while balancing the interests of subordinate elites. Material culture reveals the processes through which these kingdoms integrated Romano-British legacies with Germanic traditions. Excavations at early royal sites, including Richborough and Yevering, show continued use of Roman building techniques alongside timber halls characteristic of Germanic architecture. The coexistence of imported goods, such as Mediterranean pottery, with locally produced ceramics demonstrates ongoing trade and adaptation. Artistic motifs on metalwork, jewelry, and weaponry often combine Roman, Celtic, and Germanic stylistic elements, illustrating a syncretic visual language that reinforced emerging political and social identities. Law codes provide further insight into early governance. The Lex Ripuaria, the Kentish laws, and later West Saxon codes reflect a hybrid legal tradition, incorporating Roman principles of compensation and contract alongside Germanic customs of kinship-based justice. These codes established the basis for order, codifying obligations between rulers, freemen, and dependent communities. The integration of legal and social structures illustrates the functional synthesis of imported and local models of authority, allowing kingdoms to maintain internal cohesion despite political fragmentation. Settlement patterns and fortifications highlight the strategies leaders employed to consolidate territory. Hill forts and enclosed settlements were often repurposed for administrative and defensive purposes, while the control of arable land and waterways enabled rulers to regulate economic production and sustain military forces. Archaeological surveys indicate that early kingdoms were interconnected through trade networks and seasonal assemblies, facilitating both cooperation and competition. These structures laid the foundation for more centralized governance in subsequent centuries. Interpretive analysis reveals that the process of cultural synthesis was as critical as territorial control. First, the selective retention of Roman infrastructural and administrative practices provided continuity that legitimized new rulers in the eyes of local populations. Second, Germanic settlement patterns and social organization introduced new mechanisms of leadership, loyalty, and resource allocation, which shaped the operational dynamics of early kingdoms. Third, the blending of artistic and material traditions created a shared visual and cultural vocabulary that reinforced group cohesion and differentiated one kingdom from another. Historical sources, including Bede's retrospective accounts, underscore the perception of these kingdoms as autonomous entities, each with its own lineage of kings and territorial claims. While contemporary documentation is limited, charters, place name evidence, and burial data collectively demonstrate the emergence of political and social boundaries that persisted into the later Anglo-Saxon period. These early polities were neither fully isolated nor uniform. They formed a patchwork of interdependent communities negotiating authority, identity, and security. By the end of the 6th century, the early Anglo-Saxon kingdoms had established durable frameworks of governance, social hierarchy, and cultural identity. Leadership rested on land-based authority, kinship obligations, and integration of Roman and Germanic traditions. These developments set the stage for external influences and transformative shifts in religion, law, and administration. As Roman administrative structures faded into memory, the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms crystallized the foundations of medieval English political identity, creating the conditions for the later spread of Christianity, legal standardization, and territorial consolidation. These early kingdoms soon encountered a transformative force that reshaped governance and culture: Christianity. Religion became the first unifying institution across England's divided kingdoms. The Gregorian mission, initiated in 597 CE under Pope Gregory I, marked the formal beginning of Christianization in southern England. Augustine of Canterbury, dispatched as the mission's leader, arrived at the court of King Ethelbert of Kent and secured royal patronage for the establishment of Christian institutions. The conversion of kings provided legitimacy for the religion and facilitated the construction of churches, monasteries, and centers of clerical training. Records indicate that Augustine's episcopal authority extended to surrounding territories, forming the earliest diocesan framework on the island. These early ecclesiastical structures operated alongside existing secular authority, often serving as intermediaries in regional governance and providing administrative support. Monastic centers played a central role in consolidating Christian influence. Sites such as Canterbury and Lindisfarne functioned as hubs of literacy, education, and manuscript production. Archaeologists have uncovered foundations of timber and stone churches, as well as libraries containing both religious and secular texts, demonstrating the dual function of monastic institutions in spiritual guidance and cultural preservation. Missionaries traveled between these centers, promoting uniformity in practice and facilitating the dissemination of Latin literacy, which became increasingly important for record-keeping and communication across disparate kingdoms. The Synod of Whitby, convened in 664 CE, represented a critical moment in the alignment of English Christianity with Roman practices. Debate at the Synod focused on issues including the calculation of Easter and the tonsure of clerics, with the decision favoring Roman usage over Celtic traditions. Written accounts, primarily by Bede, described the Synod's proceedings and the political negotiation that accompanied ecclesiastical decisions. Alignment with Rome strengthened ties between England and continental Christian institutions, promoting standardized liturgy, canon law, and clerical discipline. The outcomes of Whitby facilitated the integration of religious authority into the political framework of the kingdoms, as rulers increasingly relied on the church for advice, record-keeping, and ceremonial legitimacy. Christianity spread incrementally beyond Kent, reaching Northumbria and Mercia through missionary activity and strategic alliances with local rulers. Archaeological evidence, including inscribed crosses and ecclesiastical artifacts, confirms the establishment of churches and monastic settlements throughout these regions. Church estates often encompassed significant landholdings, providing both economic support for religious activity and political influence in local affairs. The pattern of land grants recorded in charters indicates cooperation between secular leaders and ecclesiastical authorities, with religious institutions serving as stabilizing forces in otherwise fragmented political landscapes. By the early 8th century, the ecclesiastical hierarchy was firmly established, consisting of archbishops, bishops, abbots, and a network of clergy responsible for spiritual oversight and administrative functions. Records show that bishops acted as advisors to kings, participated in councils, and managed local courts, reflecting the church's integration into governance. Monastic schools trained both clerical and lay personnel, producing individuals capable of maintaining written records, legal documents, and correspondence necessary for effective rule. Archaeological and textual evidence demonstrates that literacy and administrative competence were concentrated within these religious institutions, making them indispensable for the functioning of early English kingdoms. Christian institutions also facilitated cultural standardization across the diverse kingdoms. The adoption of Roman liturgical practices, architectural styles, and ecclesiastical art provided a shared framework for religious observance and public ceremony. Cross-carved stones, illuminated manuscripts, and reliquaries illustrate both the aesthetic influence of continental Christianity and the localized adaptation of artistic forms. These cultural markers reinforced a sense of common identity among elite and clerical communities, even as political boundaries remained fluid. The establishment of ecclesiastical infrastructure created continuity and resilience in a period otherwise characterized by fragmented political authority. Churches, monasteries, and episcopal networks provided both moral and practical guidance, mediating disputes, managing land, and maintaining written records. Latin literacy and standardized ritual practices facilitated communication across kingdoms, enabling rulers and clerics to coordinate governance more effectively. By integrating religious authority with secular governance, Christianity strengthened the institutional foundations of early English society and created mechanisms for the centralization of power without eliminating regional autonomy. Christian institutions reinforced emerging concepts of kingship and law. Power in early England was defined not only by force, but by law. By the early 7th century, Anglo-Saxon kings increasingly relied on codified law to structure authority, regulate society, and reinforce social hierarchy. Ethelbert of Kent, who reigned from circa 589 to 616 CE, produced the earliest surviving English law code, written in Old English rather than Latin. The code detailed compensation rates for various offenses, including homicide, theft, and injury, establishing a system of wergild, a monetary payment to victims or their families, as a primary mechanism for maintaining social order. Records indicate that this approach allowed rulers to exercise authority over their subjects without resorting solely to military coercion, demonstrating the legal codification of power as an essential complement to personal or familial influence. The Kentish Law Code also reflects the integration of Christian principles with existing Germanic customs. For example, provisions protecting clergy and church property illustrate the moral authority of the church in secular disputes, while regulations governing personal behavior, oaths, and obligations align with both Romanized administrative concepts and traditional kinship-based justice. Archaeological and textual evidence suggests that churches were frequently involved in the enforcement of law, serving as neutral parties in compensation agreements and witnesses to contractual obligations. This fusion of moral and customary authority contributed to a framework of governance that was both locally grounded and increasingly standardized. Other early law codes, including those of Wessex, Mercia, and Northumbria, follow similar patterns of hierarchical regulation. Kings were positioned as arbiters of justice, with their authority extending through ealdormen, reeves, and local assemblies. Laws often distinguished between social classes, specifying higher compensatory rates for nobles and clergy compared to freemen and dependents, thereby codifying social stratification. Place name studies, charters, and land grants provide further evidence that legal structures underpinned territorial organization and clarified property rights, reinforcing the legitimacy of rulers over defined regions. The process of lawmaking served not only judicial functions but also political purposes. Codified laws communicated the ruler's authority to subordinate elites, facilitated the management of disputes across decentralized communities, and legitimized taxation and resource extraction. By institutionalizing compensation and obligations, kings could maintain loyalty among freemen and retainers while mitigating cycles of personal vengeance, which might otherwise destabilize fragile polities. Archaeologists have observed that settlements associated with early kingdoms often display patterns consistent with these administrative structures, including delineated landholdings and centralized assembly points. Marriage, inheritance, and kinship obligations were central components of these codes, demonstrating how social cohesion depended on clearly defined legal relationships. Laws specified the responsibilities of fathers, guardians, and extended families, reinforcing hierarchical structures at both domestic and communal levels. Records indicate that disputes involving land or personal injury were commonly adjudicated in local assemblies or shire courts, with the king or his representatives presiding. Such practices established continuity between legal theory and practical governance, linking ritualized authority with enforceable outcomes. Christianity's influence on legal codes extended beyond protection of clerical privileges. Moral precepts, such as prohibitions against false oaths, perjury, and certain forms of violence, were incorporated into secular law, creating a hybrid system in which religious ethics reinforced societal expectations. These measures promoted cohesion in a culturally heterogeneous landscape, where Germanic traditions, residual Romano-British practices, and ecclesiastical norms intersected. Codified law thus functioned as a mechanism for standardizing behavior and asserting centralized authority, even in kingdoms with limited bureaucratic capacity. Economic regulation was another dimension of early law. Codes governed trade, compensation for damaged property, and fines for theft or fraud. These provisions enabled rulers to maintain order in marketplaces and control the distribution of resources, linking economic stability with political authority. Archaeological evidence from urban centers and rural estates supports the existence of organized economic activity, coordinated with legal oversight. The combination of judicial, moral, and economic regulation strengthened both local governance and broader kingdom cohesion. As law codification became more systematic, kingship itself was framed as both protective and regulative. Authority derived legitimacy not solely from military prowess or lineage, but from the capacity to enforce justice and maintain social equilibrium. Records show that subsequent rulers expanded on Ethelbert's foundation, adapting codes to regional circumstances while preserving the principle that law served as a structural instrument of governance. This early integration of legal, religious, and social authority created the institutional frameworks that would endure throughout the Anglo-Saxon period. As governance matured, England entered a period of regional dominance and rivalry. For a time, England's fate rested in the hands of competing regional powers. By the 7th and 8th centuries, political authority in England concentrated within two dominant kingdoms, Mercia and Northumbria. Northumbria, encompassing modern northern England and parts of southern Scotland, had risen to prominence under kings such as Edwin, r. 616–633, and Oswald, r. 634–642, consolidating territory through alliances and military campaigns. Archaeological sites, including monasteries at Lindisfarne and Hexham, attest to both ecclesiastical and political centralization. Royal patronage of monasteries reinforced kings' authority while serving as administrative centers, supporting literacy, record-keeping, and cultural cohesion across northern territories. Mercia's ascent followed in the mid-8th century, with rulers such as Penda, r. 626–655, and later Offa, r. 757–796, expanding influence across central England. Sources, including the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and charters preserved in later compilations, indicate that Mercian kings exercised overlordship over neighboring territories, extracting tribute and asserting authority through both diplomacy and military action. Offa's reign, in particular, is notable for systematic territorial administration and infrastructural projects that strengthened frontier control. Offa's Dyke, a large earthwork demarcating the boundary between Mercia and Welsh kingdoms, illustrates the practical application of engineering to political and defensive objectives. Archaeological surveys confirm the scale and continuity of this project, reflecting Offa's capacity to mobilize labor and resources across extensive regions. The power dynamics between Mercia and Northumbria were mediated through warfare, alliances, and marriage diplomacy. Contemporary chronicles report frequent skirmishes, shifting alliances, and periods of temporary overlordship, demonstrating that political supremacy was neither permanent nor uncontested. These interactions required careful negotiation of authority, often balancing local autonomy with centralized oversight. Archaeological evidence, including fortified settlements and weapon deposits, corroborates textual accounts of militarized territorial management, showing how kings reinforced claims through both force and symbolic displays of power. Royal courts served as centers of administration and governance. Charters and land grants indicate that kings regulated property, adjudicated disputes, and coordinated religious endowments, integrating ecclesiastical institutions into the exercise of secular authority. The Church's involvement in governance enhanced legitimacy and facilitated communication across dispersed territories, linking regional populations to central leadership. Coinage issued under Offa further demonstrates Mercia's economic and political reach, standardizing transactions and symbolizing sovereignty. Numismatic analysis confirms extensive circulation of silver pennies, reflecting both domestic control and connections to continental trade networks. Infrastructure and urban development under Mercian and Northumbrian kings reinforced territorial cohesion. Road maintenance, riverine transport, and the establishment of administrative centers enabled both resource distribution and rapid mobilization of military forces. Archaeological findings at sites such as Repton and Tamworth illustrate the dual function of royal centers as defensive positions and political hubs. These developments highlight the integration of logistical capability with institutional authority, allowing rulers to maintain influence over wide and geographically diverse areas. Ecclesiastical alignment contributed to the consolidation of power. Monastic centers, episcopal sees, and missionary networks strengthened connections between regional authorities and the broader Christian world. Evidence from illuminated manuscripts, stone crosses, and church architecture shows that Northumbria and Mercia invested in religious and cultural infrastructure as instruments of both legitimacy and societal cohesion. The sponsorship of scholarly activity, including scriptoria producing Latin texts, reinforced the intellectual authority of the ruling elite while fostering administrative competence. The ascendancy of Mercia and Northumbria illustrates the complex interplay of military capability, political negotiation, and institutional development. Regional hegemony relied on effective management of subordinate territories, strategic alliances, and the integration of religious and economic systems. This period demonstrates that power in early medieval England was multifaceted, extending beyond battlefield success to encompass administration, diplomacy, and cultural patronage. By the mid-8th century, Mercia and Northumbria had established dominant positions within the English landscape, setting patterns of territorial control, governance, and cultural influence that would shape subsequent kingdoms. This balance of power, however, would soon be disrupted by forces arriving from beyond the North Sea, introducing new challenges to the established order. By the late 8th century, England's coasts had become accessible to a new maritime power. The first documented Scandinavian interactions with England occurred in the mid-8th century, though sporadic attacks likely preceded written records. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records a series of coastal raids, culminating in the notorious attack on the monastery of Lindisfarne in 793 CE. Contemporary accounts describe the raid as sudden and devastating, emphasizing both the wealth of ecclesiastical centers and the relative unpreparedness of local defenses. Archaeological evidence from Lindisfarne, including the destruction layers and hoarded objects, supports the textual narrative, indicating the looting of precious metals, liturgical items, and manuscripts. These raids were not isolated incidents but part of a broader pattern of opportunistic incursions targeting wealthy, lightly defended sites along the eastern and northern coasts. Economic motives underpinned the initial raids. Scandinavian groups, primarily from modern Denmark and Norway, sought access to silver, livestock, and other portable resources. Hoards discovered in England, such as those at Cordale and York, contained silver coins and jewelry of both local and continental origin, suggesting that raiding networks were integrated into wider trade circuits. These finds indicate that early raiders were not solely marauders but engaged in systematic appropriation and redistribution of wealth, reflecting both strategic planning and maritime capability. Ship construction, evidenced by burials and preserved timbers in Scandinavia, facilitated rapid coastal movement, enabling raiders to strike unexpectedly and retreat efficiently. The political fragmentation of Anglo-Saxon England created vulnerabilities exploited by Scandinavian groups. The island consisted of multiple kingdoms, including Northumbria, Mercia, and Wessex, each with independent military forces and localized governance. Coordination between kingdoms was limited, and the lack of a centralized defensive infrastructure meant that coastal regions were often isolated and exposed. Contemporary sources note repeated attacks on monasteries and towns, demonstrating that raiders identified and targeted sites where resistance would be minimal. Archaeological surveys of fortified settlements suggest that communities gradually adapted to these threats, but early responses were reactive and uneven. Settlement patterns along the east coast further influenced the nature of raids. Low-lying estuaries, navigable rivers, and natural harbors provided raiders with easy access to inland sites. Evidence from excavated ship burials, such as those in Denmark and Norway, illustrates the capability of Scandinavian seafarers to transport personnel, supplies, and loot across significant distances. Coastal Anglo-Saxon communities, reliant on maritime trade and agriculture, were particularly exposed to sudden incursions. Archaeologists have identified defensive earthworks and later coastal fortifications as a direct response to these pressures, highlighting the interaction between raiding activity and local defensive innovation. Material culture recovered from early raid sites indicates a gradual escalation in scale and organization. Initial attacks often involved small groups using speed and surprise, while later raids demonstrate more extensive coordination, including overwintering in occupied areas. Looted goods frequently show evidence of redistribution in Scandinavian territories, connecting English raids to broader North Sea exchange networks. Ship burials and imported artifacts found in Scandinavian cemeteries suggest that raiding success enhanced status and facilitated political advancement among northern elites, linking maritime warfare with internal social hierarchies. The historiographical record emphasizes that these raids were part of a developing pattern rather than a sudden invasion. Early raiding activity primarily targeted economic and religious assets, avoiding large-scale territorial conquest. Textual sources, including annals and chronicles, distinguish between seasonal raiding and subsequent settlement, indicating that England's exposure evolved over decades. Archaeological evidence from coastal settlements, hordes, and burial sites corroborates this gradual process, demonstrating that Viking impact was cumulative and regionally variable. Early encounters also influenced Anglo-Saxon political and military adaptation. Kings and local elites began to fortify vulnerable settlements, maintain standing forces along the coasts, and coordinate regional defense strategies. Coinage hoards and changes in material culture suggest increased economic caution and strategic planning in response to raiding pressures. While these adaptations did not prevent initial losses, they laid the groundwork for more sustained resistance and eventual integration of Scandinavian forces in later periods. By the mid-9th century, raiding activity had transitioned into more permanent occupation and territorial influence. The sporadic coastal attacks of the late 8th century presaged the arrival of larger, organized military forces that would establish the Danelaw and reshape the political landscape of England. The early raids, though limited in immediate scope, exposed vulnerabilities, prompted strategic adaptation, and marked the beginning of sustained Scandinavian engagement with Anglo-Saxon society. Raiding soon evolved into sustained military presence and territorial control. For the first time, England faced organized conquest rather than seasonal raiding. In 865 CE, England encountered a dramatic escalation in Scandinavian activity with the arrival of what contemporary sources refer to as the Great Heathen Army. Unlike earlier raiders who struck opportunistically along the coasts, this force operated with sustained organization, targeting multiple kingdoms simultaneously. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and later narratives describe campaigns across Northumbria, East Anglia, and Mercia, detailing the systematic capture of towns, fortifications, and resource centers. Archaeological evidence, including weapon hoards, siege sites, and modified defensive structures, corroborates the chronicles account, indicating coordinated military strategy rather than sporadic incursions. Northumbria was among the first regions to fall. York, a former Roman and Anglo-Saxon urban center, quickly became a strategic stronghold under Scandinavian control. Excavations in York reveal the presence of Scandinavian-style houses, imported artifacts, and changes in settlement patterns, indicating both military occupation and administrative adaptation. The conquest of Northumbria allowed the army to secure supply lines, establish bases for further campaigns, and exert control over a previously fragmented northern polity. Political power shifted from local kings to Scandinavian leaders who imposed new structures of governance while coexisting with remnants of Anglo-Saxon administration. East Anglia and Mercia were subsequently targeted, with campaigns marked by sieges, forced submission, and negotiated settlements. Sources describe the subjugation of local rulers, tribute extraction, and redistribution of land to Scandinavian elites. Archaeological evidence, such as fortified buzz and strategically placed encampments, demonstrates a deliberate approach to territorial consolidation. Scandinavian leaders transitioned from raiders into rulers, instituting long-term occupation that required the establishment of administrative and economic systems. This transformation reflects a broader structural shift from episodic violence to organized, sustained governance. The formalization of territorial control led to the creation of the Danelaw, a region of eastern and northern England under Scandinavian influence. Legal and administrative practices within the Danelaw diverged from those of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Textual sources, including the laws of Alfred and Guthrum, record treaties that delineated boundaries, regulated tribute, and established separate legal codes for English and Danish populations. Archaeological findings, including boundary markers and settlement reorganization, confirm the physical implementation of these divisions. Scandinavian law emphasized collective responsibility, compensation, and community obligations, contrasting with existing Anglo-Saxon wergild structures while coexisting in areas of mixed population. The imposition of the Danelaw reconfigured England's political geography. Formerly autonomous kingdoms were now partitioned, with the east and north under Scandinavian jurisdiction and Wessex remaining the principal Anglo-Saxon stronghold in the south. Coinage, place names, and settlement patterns within the Danelaw reveal a blend of Scandinavian and Anglo-Saxon practices, reflecting both continuity and adaptation. Excavated hoards of coins, weights, and metalwork suggest integration into North Sea trade networks, while Scandinavian-style buildings illustrate settlement reorganization. This structural transformation extended beyond military occupation, influencing governance, law, economy, and cultural practices across occupied territories. Military innovation and administrative control were interdependent. Scandinavian leaders constructed fortified encampments and reused existing Anglo-Saxon buzz to assert authority and control trade routes. Archaeological surveys indicate that these fortifications were not temporary but adapted for long-term use, serving as both defensive positions and administrative centers. These sites facilitated taxation, dispute resolution, and military mobilization, demonstrating the organizational capacity of Scandinavian rulers. The transition from raiding to governance required sustained coordination, underscoring the structural significance of the Great Heathen Army's campaigns. The treaties and agreements that formalized the Danelaw illustrate the negotiation of authority between Anglo-Saxon and Scandinavian powers. The Treaty of Wedmore, concluded after the campaigns of 878 CE, codified boundaries and established conditions for coexistence, including religious toleration and the exchange of hostages. Legal distinctions allowed Danish settlers to maintain their customary practices while recognizing the overarching authority of regional rulers. This approach mitigated resistance, facilitated economic integration, and enabled Scandinavian leaders to consolidate long-term control over conquered territories. The establishment of the Danelaw marked a critical juncture in English history. England was no longer solely a patchwork of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. It now contained regions under foreign law and governance, altering political, economic, and cultural patterns. Settlement and administration under Scandinavian rule influenced local customs, legal practices, and material culture, leaving a lasting imprint on the landscape. Archaeological evidence of Scandinavian-style houses, burial practices, and craft production attests to enduring social integration and cultural exchange. By the end of this period, the balance of power in England had shifted significantly. Mercia and Northumbria, once dominant Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, were partially absorbed into the Danelaw, while Wessex emerged as the principal center of resistance and continuity for Anglo-Saxon governance. The transition from seasonal raiding to organized occupation demonstrated the capacity of Scandinavian forces to impose structural change on England's political landscape, setting the stage for subsequent conflicts, consolidation, and eventual reconquest. Resistance to Scandinavian rule emerged most effectively in Wessex. Survival required not victory, but structural adaptation. In the aftermath of the Treaty of Wedmore, 878 CE, Wessex faced the pressing task of securing its territory against continued Scandinavian incursions. Alfred, who had ascended the throne in 871 CE, responded not merely with military engagement but with a comprehensive program of defensive and administrative reform. These measures emphasized institutional resilience over immediate conquest, prioritizing sustainable governance, regional coordination, and the long-term stability of the kingdom. The innovations implemented under Alfred's leadership would shape the trajectory of Anglo-Saxon England for generations. Central to Alfred's strategy was the construction and systematic reinforcement of fortified settlements, or buzz. Existing towns and abandoned Roman sites were adapted for defense, while new fortifications were established at strategic locations to protect trade routes, river crossings, and agricultural regions. Archaeological surveys across southern England, including sites at Winchester, Wareham, and Burpham, reveal earthworks, ditches, and timber palisades consistent with the base system described in the Burghall Heidage, a contemporary record of fortification assignments. Each BA was designed to support a designated population, with defensive capacity proportional to the surrounding territory, ensuring rapid local response to raiding parties. Complementing the BA network was a reorganization of the military. Alfred implemented a system of rotating service obligations among local freemen, ensuring that a standing defensive presence could be maintained without exhausting the kingdom's manpower. The coordination of BUZ with regional levies allowed Wessex to respond flexibly to threats while preserving agricultural productivity. Contemporary chronicles, supported by archaeological evidence of weapon deposits and temporary encampments, indicate that this approach significantly reduced the effectiveness of Viking raiding strategies, demonstrating the strategic value of coordinated, decentralized defense. Alfred also pursued legal reform as a means of reinforcing social cohesion and institutional authority. Building upon existing Anglo-Saxon codes, he integrated Christian principles with customary law to produce a codified system that addressed both secular and ecclesiastical concerns. The Doombook, or Alfred's Law Code, formalized obligations regarding property, crime, and compensation, reinforcing royal authority while providing predictable mechanisms for dispute resolution. Charters and land grants from the period indicate that legal reforms were closely linked to administrative practices, with the leadership and regional officials charged with enforcement, illustrating the interplay between law, governance, and territorial control. Education and literacy were also central to Alfred's program of institutional strengthening. Recognizing the importance of record-keeping and administrative competence, he sponsored translations of Latin texts into Old English and established centers of learning within his court and monastic institutions. Manuscripts produced under Alfred's patronage, including copies of Bede's ecclesiastical history and pastoral manuals, facilitated clerical training and bureaucratic efficiency. These initiatives enhanced the kingdom's capacity to maintain continuity of governance, standardize legal practice, and ensure that administrative knowledge was preserved within the royal and ecclesiastical elite. Economic organizations supported these defensive and administrative measures. BUZ functioned as both military and economic hubs, enabling markets, resource collection, and redistribution of supplies to sustain garrisons. Evidence from coin hoards and minting operations indicates that Alfred centralized currency production, improving fiscal oversight and facilitating the collection of tribute and taxation. Integration of economic, military, and legal systems allowed Wessex to maintain operational resilience during periods of Scandinavian pressure, demonstrating that institutional infrastructure was as critical as battlefield success. Archaeological findings further underscore the systemic nature of Alfred's reforms. Excavated sites reveal consistent layouts, with coordinated access routes, storage areas, and defensive works, reflecting careful planning and administrative oversight. Evidence of repaired bridges, maintained roads, and organized timber resources illustrates the logistical capacity required to sustain both military and civilian populations. These structural improvements strengthened Wessex's internal cohesion and ensured the kingdom's long-term viability against external threats. Alfred's reforms highlight the interplay between governance and survival. By creating a network of defensible sites, restructuring military obligations, codifying law, and promoting literacy, he established a foundation that allowed Wessex to endure despite ongoing Scandinavian activity. These measures did not produce immediate political dominance beyond the kingdom's borders but generated stability that enabled Wessex to resist incursions effectively, manage resources efficiently, and cultivate administrative competence. Contemporary and later chronicles consistently attribute the kingdom's resilience to Alfred's strategic vision rather than to single victories on the battlefield. The combination of defensive architecture, legal codification, military organization, and educational revival produced a multifaceted system capable of adaptation and sustainability. By embedding authority in institutions rather than relying solely on individual leadership, Alfred ensured that Wessex possessed the structural capacity to survive and eventually reclaim territory from Scandinavian control. Archaeological, numismatic, and textual evidence collectively demonstrates that these reforms had long-lasting impact, establishing patterns of governance that influenced subsequent rulers. These reforms enabled future generations to pursue political unification. Unification emerged through administration as much as warfare. Following the reforms of Alfred the Great, Wessex entered a period of territorial expansion under his successors, notably Edward the Elder r. 899–924, and his sister Ethelflaed, Lady of the Mercians r. 911–918. Building on the network, coordinated military obligations, and legal structures established by Alfred, these rulers pursued a systematic campaign to reclaim Danish-controlled regions and integrate them into emerging English governance. Textual sources, including the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, document campaigns across Mercia, East Anglia, and the Danelaw, emphasizing not only military engagement but also administrative consolidation and the establishment of enduring institutions. Edward the Elder's campaigns targeted strategically significant locations, including fortified towns along the Thames and the East Anglian coastline. Archaeological surveys indicate that these sites were reinforced, expanded, and adapted to serve both military and administrative purposes. Those reclaimed from Danish control were integrated into Wessex's defensive network, allowing rapid troop mobilization and the maintenance of supply lines. Coordination between Edward and regional leaders, including Ethelflaed in Mercia, demonstrates an early model of collaborative governance designed to extend authority while accommodating local elites. Ethelflaed's leadership in Mercia was particularly notable for combining military strategy with regional administration. She directed the construction and fortification of towns such as Tamworth and Stafford, providing both defensive capacity and administrative oversight. Charters and archaeological evidence suggest that Ethelflaed exercised authority over land grants, legal adjudication, and local economic management, reflecting the integration of Mercian territories into a broader political framework. Her coordination with Edward ensured that Wessex and Mercia acted in concert, strengthening resistance against Scandinavian forces and establishing the foundations for a unified kingdom. Administrative integration was central to consolidation. Reclaimed regions were incorporated into a structured system of governance, with appointed ealdormen, reeves, and burgh officials responsible for law enforcement, taxation, and military organization. This system extended Alfred's model, creating a network of administrative nodes capable of sustaining authority over diverse and geographically dispersed territories. Numismatic evidence, including standardized coinage, reflects economic centralization and fiscal oversight, further linking conquered territories to the institutional core of Wessex. Military campaigns during this period were characterized by both direct engagement and strategic fortification. Excavated sites reveal patterns of expansion and reinforcement, indicating that the re-establishment of Anglo-Saxon authority relied on the combination of offensive and defensive measures. Coordination between local garrisons and regional commanders allowed Edward and Ethelflaed to project power effectively while maintaining territorial stability. Archaeological findings, including weapon deposits and defensive earthworks, support textual accounts of systematic campaigns that combine siege operations, reconnaissance, and occupation. Cultural and legal integration accompanied territorial expansion. English law, codified under Alfred and refined by Edward, was introduced into reconquered areas, standardizing dispute resolution, compensation practices, and property rights. Charters indicate that land tenure and local governance were regulated according to Wessex norms, reinforcing centralized authority while acknowledging existing local hierarchies. Ecclesiastical networks also played a role in consolidation, with bishops and monasteries functioning as intermediaries between regional populations and central governance, facilitating both literacy and administrative continuity. Economic organization supported the political consolidation of reclaimed territories. These functioned as centers of trade, production, and taxation, allowing rulers to extract resources efficiently and maintain garrisons. Coinage from East Anglia and Mercia demonstrates the extension of fiscal networks into formerly Danish-controlled regions, standardizing currency and integrating markets. The coordination of economic, military, and administrative systems reflects a deliberate strategy of institutional consolidation that complemented military victories, ensuring that political authority was durable rather than episodic. The integration of local elites into the Wessex-led system further strengthened consolidation. Charters and land grants indicate that loyalty was secured through negotiated settlement and recognition of pre-existing status, while military and administrative responsibilities were delegated to trusted leaders. This approach allowed Edward and Ethelflaed to extend authority without provoking widespread resistance, creating a foundation for more centralized governance in the decades that followed. By the early 10th century, the combination of territorial conquest, administrative standardization, and integration of local elites had significantly expanded West Saxon influence across southern and central England. Reclaimed territories were no longer loosely held. They were embedded within a coherent framework of defensive, legal, and fiscal institutions. Archaeological evidence from fortified towns, road networks, and settlement patterns demonstrates the structural basis of this expansion, highlighting the interplay of governance and military strategy. Political unity, however, required more than territorial control. The integration of culture, law, and administration across diverse regions was essential to sustain authority and establish a lasting kingdom. The campaigns of Edward the Elder and Ethelflaed exemplify the combination of military action and institutional development that enabled Wessex to lead the consolidation of England. Political unity required cultural and legal standardization. By the 10th century, England existed as a single political entity. Athelstan, who ascended to the throne in 927 CE, is widely regarded as the first king to exercise authority over a unified England. Building on the territorial expansion and administrative consolidation achieved by Edward the Elder and Ethelflaed, Athelstan secured both political and symbolic control over regions previously under Danish and local Anglo-Saxon authority. Textual evidence, including charters and the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, documents the incorporation of Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, and Wessex under a single monarchy, establishing the institutional foundation for a centralized English kingship. Charters issued during Ethelstan's reign demonstrate a sophisticated administrative apparatus. These documents regulated land grants, recorded legal agreements, and formalized obligations between the crown, the church, and the nobility. Analysis of surviving charters indicates consistent use of royal seals and standardized language, suggesting a coordinated bureaucratic system capable of maintaining authority across disparate regions. The issuance of charters also reinforced royal legitimacy, linking the monarchy to both sacred authority and secular governance, while promoting integration of local elites into the emerging national framework. Coinage played a critical role in consolidating Ethelstan's authority. Silver pennies bearing the king's name and image circulated widely, standardizing economic transactions and reinforcing recognition of royal power. Numismatic evidence indicates careful control over minting, reflecting the centralization of fiscal authority and the integration of former Danish territories into a unified monetary system. Coins also facilitated trade and taxation, connecting economic infrastructure with political governance and enabling the crown to mobilize resources effectively. Military organization remained central to Ethelstan's consolidation of England. The Battle of Brunanburh in 937 CE, recorded in contemporary poetry and chronicles, represented a decisive confrontation between Ethelstan's forces and a coalition of Viking, Scots, and Strathclyde Briton armies. Archaeological surveys of potential battle sites, combined with weapon and hoard discoveries, corroborate accounts of large-scale engagement. Victory at Brunanburh secured Ethelstan's authority, demonstrated the kingdom's capacity for coordinated defense, and reinforced the perception of a single, indivisible English monarchy. Legal and administrative measures complemented military success. Athelstan extended and refined existing Anglo-Saxon law codes, codifying obligations, land rights, and compensation practices across newly integrated territories. The king relied on local officials, bishops, and ealdormen to enforce legal and fiscal regulations, creating a network of governance that linked regional authority to the central monarchy. Ecclesiastical cooperation was crucial, as churches and monastic centers functioned as intermediaries in administration, literacy, and record-keeping, further embedding institutional cohesion. The integration of previously distinct regions required cultural as well as political alignment. Ethelstan's reign witnessed the standardization of court ceremony, administrative terminology, and religious observance. Ecclesiastical networks, particularly in Northumbria and Mercia, were reorganized to reflect allegiance to the central monarchy, and church councils facilitated uniformity in liturgical practice. Archaeological evidence, including ecclesiastical architecture, reliquaries, and manuscript production, illustrates the convergence of artistic and religious culture across the unified kingdom, reinforcing political authority through shared institutional and cultural frameworks. External diplomacy and alliances reinforced internal consolidation. Athelstan maintained correspondence and treaty relations with continental rulers, including the kings of France and Germany, and arranged dynastic marriages to secure strategic alliances. Charters and correspondence attest to these diplomatic networks, highlighting the interplay of domestic governance and international recognition. Ethelstan's ability to project authority beyond England's borders enhanced legitimacy and deterred external threats, strengthening the institutional foundation of the kingdom. Despite the appearance of stability, England remained vulnerable to renewed pressure. Scandinavian settlements in the north and east, combined with persistent threats from Scotland and Strathclyde, meant that unity required continual military vigilance, administrative oversight, and strategic diplomacy. Ethelstan's institutional reforms, administration, standardized coinage, legal codification, and ecclesiastical coordination, provided mechanisms for sustaining authority, but the centralized monarchy was dependent on capable regional enforcement and effective resource management. By the end of Ethelstan's reign in 939 CE, England had achieved unprecedented political cohesion. Territorial unification, centralized administration, legal standardization, and military success established a framework for enduring governance. Charters, coins, and military records collectively demonstrate that the First Kingdom of England was not merely a nominal union but a structurally integrated polity. Unity remained vulnerable to renewed external pressure. Conquest did not erase institutions, it absorbed them. The late 10th and early 11th centuries in England were marked by renewed Scandinavian intervention and intermittent political instability. Athelred II, known as the Unready, r. 978 to 1016, faced sustained Viking attacks that exploited weaknesses in regional defenses and strained royal resources. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and Charters record repeated raids, particularly along the east coast, culminating in payments of Danegeld, a system of tribute intended to buy temporary peace. Coin hoards and numismatic studies confirm large-scale extraction of silver to fund these payments, reflecting the fiscal pressures imposed by foreign incursions and the necessity of maintaining administrative continuity in the face of external threats. Danegeld payments highlight both the resilience and vulnerability of English governance. While these levies represented a fiscal burden, they were facilitated by pre-existing administrative mechanisms for taxation and resource collection established under Alfred and his successors. Buzz, reeve networks, and regional officials collected and redistributed wealth, illustrating that institutional infrastructure remained operative even under duress. Legal and fiscal systems allowed the crown to mobilize resources efficiently, despite repeated Scandinavian attacks, demonstrating the durability of administrative frameworks amid political turbulence. The death of Athelred II's forces and continued dissatisfaction among Viking leaders opened the door for Sweyn Forkbeard of Denmark, who launched a sustained campaign to seize the English throne in 1013. Sweyn's conquest was swift and decisive, supported by Scandinavian armies that leveraged prior knowledge of England's political geography, including buzz, trade centers, and regional networks. Archaeological evidence, including fortifications reinforced or repurposed during this period, indicates that Sweyn's forces systematically incorporated existing defensive and administrative infrastructure rather than dismantling it, emphasizing the pragmatic adaptation of English institutions to new rulers. Sweyn's death in 1014 temporarily restored Athelred to the throne, but instability persisted. Renewed conflict culminated in the successful conquest by Nut, r. 1016 to 1035, Sweyn's son, who systematically consolidated authority across England. Nut maintained the existing administrative structures, including the base system, regional ealdormen, and reeve offices, while integrating Danish officials into governance. Charters issued under Nut demonstrate continuity in landholding, legal adjudication, and ecclesiastical oversight, showing that Scandinavian rulers prioritized stability and institutional efficiency over radical restructuring. Military and defensive structures established under Alfred and Edward remained central to governance. Buzz and fortified towns continued to serve as both defensive positions and administrative centers, facilitating troop mobilization, taxation, and regional oversight. Archaeological surveys at sites such as London, York, and Wareham reveal maintenance and adaptation of these structures, reflecting Nut's strategy of consolidating power by leveraging existing infrastructure. The integration of Scandinavian forces into established defensive and administrative networks allowed England to function as a coherent polity despite the presence of foreign rulers. Legal and fiscal continuity under Scandinavian kings ensured that governance remained effective. Ethelred's law codes, refined and applied regionally, continued to influence dispute resolution, compensation, and landholding practices. Nut issued charters and legal edicts that reinforced these principles, demonstrating pragmatic adaptation to the social and political realities of England. Ecclesiastical networks, including bishops and monastic institutions, were maintained and even expanded, reflecting the ongoing centrality of the Church in both spiritual and administrative governance. Economic integration also persisted under Scandinavian rule. Danegeld payments, while initially coercive, relied on the structured collection of silver and goods through pre-existing fiscal mechanisms. Nut implemented systematic taxation to fund both domestic administration and military obligations, extending the Wessex-era model of fiscal governance into a kingdom under Danish rule. Numismatic evidence, including coinage bearing Nut's image and inscriptions, reflects both the assertion of royal authority and continuity with prior monetary systems, ensuring economic stability across England. The absorption of English institutions by Scandinavian rulers illustrates the adaptability and resilience of governance structures. Rather than eradicating existing systems, conquerors recognized the efficiency and legitimacy provided by entrenched administrative, legal, and military mechanisms. This pragmatic approach allowed Nut to consolidate authority rapidly, minimize disruption to daily governance, and maintain a functional kingdom across a diverse and previously fragmented landscape. Archaeological and textual evidence consistently supports the conclusion that English institutions endured and adapted, rather than collapsing under foreign rule. By 1016, following the death of Athelred and the consolidation of power by Nut, England had entered a period of relative stability under a unified monarchy. The integration of Scandinavian leadership into the framework established by Alfred, Edward, and Ethelflaed ensured continuity in law, administration, defense, and economic management. England's political structures had proven resilient, capable of absorbing external conquest while maintaining functional governance. This continuity shaped post-conquest governance. 1066 was a crisis of succession, not inevitability. The death of Edward the Confessor in January 1066 triggered a succession crisis that destabilized England and set the stage for foreign intervention. Edward died childless, leaving no clear heir, while multiple claimants, including Harold Godwin's son, William of Normandy, and Harald Hardrada of Norway, asserted competing rights to the English throne. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and Norman sources emphasize the contested nature of these claims, reflecting legal, dynastic, and political ambiguities inherent in late Anglo-Saxon succession practices. Harold Godwin's son, elected king by the Witenagemot, represented the English aristocracy's attempt to preserve internal continuity, while William's claim rested on alleged promises by Edward and papal support, illustrating the intersection of domestic custom and external influence. The political crisis was compounded by the strategic vulnerability of England's southern and northern frontiers. Harald Hardrada's invasion in the north, culminating in the Battle of Stamford Bridge in September 1066, revealed the necessity of rapid military mobilization. Harold Godwinson's forces successfully repelled Hardrada, but the confrontation exhausted resources and delayed defensive preparations in the south. Contemporary accounts, supported by battlefield archaeology, indicate that the English army faced logistical strain, limited manpower, and reliance on local levies, highlighting the structural challenges of defending a kingdom under contested succession. William of Normandy's subsequent invasion in September 1066 capitalized on these vulnerabilities. Landing at Pevensey with a well-organized army and supporting fleet, William brought combined forces of cavalry, infantry, and archers, representing a significant tactical innovation relative to Anglo-Saxon military organization. The ensuing Battle of Hastings on October 14, 1066, decisively determined the outcome of the succession crisis. Textual sources, including the Bayeux Tapestry and contemporary chronicles, describe coordinated Norman attacks, feigned retreats, and the eventual death of Harold Godwin's son, emphasizing the interaction of military strategy and leadership in establishing legitimacy. Archaeological investigations corroborate battlefield features, including defensive positions and weapon distribution, confirming the scale and intensity of the engagement. William's victory did not merely resolve a dynastic dispute. It signaled a transformation in the mechanisms of authority and governance. Following Hastings, William faced the challenge of asserting control over a kingdom with entrenched Anglo-Saxon institutions, multiple local power centers, and cultural continuity. Contemporary charters and doomsday evidence suggest that he combined military occupation with administrative adaptation, recognizing the necessity of integrating existing structures to maintain order while establishing Norman dominance. Land confiscations, strategic castle construction, and redistribution of estates to Norman elites served both as instruments of control and as mechanisms to replace contested English authority with loyal vassals. Norman claims to legitimacy relied on both conquest and sanctioned authority. Papal support, documented in letters and bulls, reinforced William's assertion that his rule was divinely sanctioned. The integration of ecclesiastical endorsement into political legitimacy reflected continuity with Anglo-Saxon reliance on church authority while extending influence through Norman administrative and clerical networks. Control over episcopal appointments and the restructuring of monastic institutions further consolidated power, demonstrating that Norman authority was established through legal, religious, and military channels. The immediate post-conquest period also involved addressing residual resistance. Revolts in the north and southwest, documented in chronicles and corroborated by archaeological evidence of destruction layers in towns and fortifications, underscored the challenges of establishing lasting governance. William responded through a combination of punitive measures and administrative reorganization, laying the foundation for a centralized Norman monarchy that could enforce law, levy taxes, and mobilize military forces across a unified kingdom. Victory at Hastings, therefore, was not an endpoint but the initiation of a broader process of consolidation. The conquest addressed the succession crisis but demanded structural measures to secure authority, integrate local elites, and maintain order in a culturally and politically diverse landscape. William's approach combined military strength with institutional adaptation, ensuring that Norman rule could extend beyond temporary occupation to enduring governance. Victory demanded long-term control. Stone fortifications reshaped political geography. Following the Norman Conquest, William I implemented a systematic program of military occupation designed to secure and stabilize his newly acquired kingdom. Central to this strategy was the construction of castles, which served as both defensive strongpoints and centers of regional administration. Early fortifications, often motte and bailey structures, were established at strategic locations including river crossings, trade routes, and urban centers. Archaeological evidence from sites such as Durham, Windsor, and York demonstrates rapid construction, strategic placement, and a combination of timber and later stone fortifications, illustrating the dual function of castles as instruments of control and symbols of Norman authority. Castles enabled the suppression of resistance and facilitated rapid military response. Rebellions in northern England, including the uprisings that precipitated the harrying of the North, 1069 to 1070, were contained through a combination of fortification and punitive expeditions. Contemporary chronicles, such as the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and Norman accounts, emphasized the use of castles as staging points for military operations, enabling garrisons to project force across surrounding territories. Archaeological layers of destruction in northern towns correspond with these campaigns, confirming both the severity of suppression and the strategic effectiveness of fortifications. The castle network also functioned as an administrative infrastructure. Each stronghold housed a Norman castellan responsible for local governance, law enforcement, and taxation. Charters and estate records from the period indicate that these officials coordinated land surveys, levy collection, and judicial functions, integrating conquered regions into the broader Norman state. Castles often became nuclei for new urban development, encouraging economic activity while consolidating control over local populations. Numismatic evidence, including regional minting of coins near castle sites, reflects the coordination of economic and political authority. Castle construction reshaped England's political geography. By establishing fortified positions at key locations, the Normans were able to dominate communication routes, river valleys, and regional centers, effectively controlling both movement and military potential. Survey data and excavation reports demonstrate that strategic placement enabled rapid troop deployment and surveillance over surrounding lands, creating a networked system of territorial dominance that extended Norman influence into previously autonomous or resistant areas. The evolution from timber, motte, and bailey structures to stone fortifications reinforced long-term control. Timber castles, rapidly erected following the conquest, were initially sufficient to assert authority and deter insurgency. Over time, many were rebuilt in stone to provide enduring defense and administrative stability. Surviving examples at the Tower of London, Rochester, and Warwick illustrate how durable architecture allowed the monarchy to maintain long-term presence, enforce law, and project power, reflecting both military pragmatism and symbolic assertion of authority. Castles also facilitated the integration of Norman and local elites. By establishing garrisons staffed with loyal followers and embedding administrative personnel, William ensured that Norman authority was directly linked to governance, taxation, and legal enforcement. Local populations were brought under supervision, while displaced or resistant landholders were replaced by trusted vassals. This approach created a hierarchical structure of control, combining military force with institutional governance to stabilize the kingdom. The combination of defensive strength and administrative function made the castle network central to the consolidation of Norman rule. Fortifications were not merely military installations. They were nodes through which the monarchy exercised legal, fiscal, and social authority. Archaeological evidence confirms that castles were accompanied by associated urban development, including markets, roads, and administrative centers, embedding them within the broader landscape of Norman governance. Control of territory through castles allowed the crown to enforce law, extract resources, and coordinate military and administrative activities across England. The integration of fortifications into regional governance enabled long-term consolidation, ensuring that resistance could be suppressed and authority maintained beyond the initial conquest. Control required administrative knowledge. Governance became measurable. In 1086, William I commissioned the Domesday Book, a comprehensive survey of landholding, resources, and fiscal obligations across England. This unprecedented administrative undertaking documented estates, tenants, livestock, mills, and arable land, providing the crown with a precise assessment of wealth and obligations. Surviving manuscripts reveal standardized entries, detailing both Anglo-Saxon and Norman landholders, reflecting a sophisticated bureaucratic apparatus capable of compiling information from diverse regions. The survey enabled systematic taxation, facilitated military and administrative planning, and reinforced royal authority by making land tenure and obligations transparent and enforceable. The Domesday Survey codified feudal relationships between the crown, barons, and tenants-in-chief. Landholding was organized hierarchically, with all property held ultimately from the king, who granted estates to loyal nobles in exchange for military service and political allegiance. Charters and Domesday entries indicate precise obligations, including the provision of knights, payment of dues, and administrative duties, illustrating the integration of feudal structures into existing English governance. By formalizing land tenure, William ensured loyalty, centralized authority, and created a framework for long-term stability. Fiscal oversight was a central function of the Domesday Book. By enumerating resources, livestock, and production capacity, the crown could calculate taxation and obligations accurately. Coinage, tolls, and levies were aligned with recorded assets, ensuring that revenue collection was equitable and enforceable. Numismatic evidence, combined with Domesday entries, demonstrates that the crown maintained control over both monetary and agricultural resources, integrating economic management with political authority. The survey also provided legal documentation to resolve disputes over landholding, preventing contested claims from undermining royal prerogative. Domesday reflected continuity as well as transformation. While feudal structures were introduced, the survey also incorporated existing Anglo-Saxon institutions. Local governance through reeves, hundred courts, and buzz remained operational, and pre-conquest landholding patterns were recorded alongside Norman grants. This pragmatic approach allowed William to assert authority without dismantling functional systems, creating a hybrid administrative structure that combined the efficiency of Norman control with the familiarity of Anglo-Saxon practices. Regional differentiation is evident in the Domesday data. Northern and western counties, which had experienced resistance and rebellion during William's reign, were recorded with additional attention to fortifications and arable capacity. Southern and eastern counties, more fully integrated into Norman control, show detailed recording of manors, mills, and tenants, reflecting administrative precision and economic exploitation. Archaeological evidence, including manorial sites and surviving structures, aligns with Domesday entries, confirming the survey's practical basis in observable settlement patterns and resource management. The survey also reinforced social hierarchy. By documenting obligations of peasants, villeins, and free tenants, the crown formalized social and economic roles across the kingdom. These records established expectations for labor, rent, and services, creating a predictable system of governance that strengthened both royal authority and the enforcement capacity of local lords. Feudal obligations were therefore legally codified and practically enforceable, ensuring that political stability was reinforced by economic and social regulation. Domesday's compilation exemplifies the integration of military, administrative, and fiscal objectives. By making landholding and resources measurable, the crown could plan military levies, allocate responsibilities, and assess revenue potential. This empirical approach to governance marked a significant evolution from earlier Anglo-Saxon and early Norman administrative practices, embedding accountability and oversight into the structure of rule. Norman systems evolved into stable institutions. Cultural change followed political control. Following the Norman Conquest, the ecclesiastical structure of England underwent significant reform, aligning the church more closely with continental practices and consolidating royal influence. William I replaced or reappointed bishops and abbots, often with Norman clergy loyal to the crown. Chronicles and episcopal records indicate that pre-conquest English bishops were displaced or subordinated, while new appointments enforced uniformity in liturgical practice, clerical discipline, and administrative reporting. Monastic institutions, including cathedrals and abbeys, were restructured according to continental models, emphasizing adherence to canonical rules, the Benedictine order, and standardized clerical administration. Reform extended to the broader Anglo-Norman elite, whose replacement of native English lords ensured loyalty and facilitated integration of governance and culture. Land confiscations documented in charters and the Domesday Book illustrate the systematic redistribution of estates to Norman nobles. These elites occupied positions of political and military authority while also influencing local society, including economic management, legal enforcement, and patronage of religious institutions. The replacement of pre-conquest leaders with Normans created a hierarchical society oriented around loyalty to the crown and facilitated the implementation of feudal obligations. Language and administrative culture underwent parallel transformation. Anglo-Norman French became the language of the court, legal documents, and governance, while Latin continued to serve ecclesiastical and scholarly functions. Charters, legal texts, and correspondence reveal the gradual integration of French terminology into administration, reflecting both practical governance needs and the symbolic assertion of Norman authority. This linguistic shift facilitated centralized control, coordination among elites, and the standardization of legal and fiscal practices, while also creating a cultural distinction between ruling elites and the Anglo-Saxon population. Ecclesiastical reform reinforced royal authority and institutional stability. Bishops and abbots were required to report directly to the crown, ensuring that church resources, land, and personnel supported political objectives. Synods and councils convened under Norman oversight codified disciplinary norms, administrative procedures, and doctrinal conformity, aligning the English church with broader continental trends. Monastic centers contributed to literacy, record-keeping, and local governance, reinforcing both administrative capacity and social cohesion across the kingdom. Archaeological evidence from cathedral rebuilds and monastic complexes demonstrates the physical manifestation of these reforms in architecture, layout, and urban development. The integration of church reform and elite replacement had significant implications for social and political control. Norman lords and clerics functioned as intermediaries between the crown and local communities, administering justice, collecting taxes, and supervising agricultural production. Charters and manorial records indicate that the coordination of secular and ecclesiastical authority reinforced the hierarchical structure of Anglo-Norman society, ensuring compliance and stability. Monastic endowments, religious patronage, and oversight of parish organization strengthened the legitimacy of Norman rulers while embedding continental administrative norms into English society. Education and literacy were also enhanced under ecclesiastical reform. Monastic schools and cathedral chapters became centers of learning, preserving Latin scholarship and producing clerks capable of managing royal and ecclesiastical administration. Manuscripts, charters, and legal texts from this period demonstrate an increased capacity for record-keeping, legal codification, and bureaucratic coordination. These developments contributed to institutional continuity and strengthened the administrative foundations necessary for sustained political control. By the end of the 11th century, Anglo-Norman society was characterized by the fusion of Norman political and cultural practices with pre-existing English structures. Church reform, elite replacement, and linguistic integration facilitated centralized governance, legal standardization, and social hierarchy, consolidating the outcomes of the Norman conquest. These measures ensured that political, cultural, and administrative authority was embedded within a coherent system, capable of enduring beyond the reign of William I and setting the stage for subsequent rulers. These systems matured under later rulers. Authority increasingly relied on systems, not personalities. Following the consolidation of Norman rule, the reign of Henry I, 1100 to 1135 CE, marked a period of administrative sophistication and institutional expansion in England. Henry inherited a kingdom stabilized by castle networks, feudal obligations, and ecclesiastical alignment, but he recognized that durable authority required systematic governance rather than reliance on personal charisma or battlefield success. Contemporary charters, pipe rolls, and chronicle accounts indicate that Henry implemented mechanisms to monitor taxation, enforce legal obligations, and coordinate regional governance, reflecting a deliberate strategy of bureaucratic centralization. The exchequer, formalized under Henry I, became a cornerstone of fiscal administration. It provided a standardized process for recording income, managing royal revenues, and auditing sheriffs and local officials. Pipe rolls from the period demonstrate detailed accounting of fines, feudal dues, and profits from royal lands, showing that revenue collection was regularized and verifiable. This system allowed the crown to finance military campaigns, infrastructure, and court functions without dependence on ad hoc levies, highlighting the integration of administrative procedure with royal authority. Sheriffs and local officials functioned as intermediaries between the monarchy and regional communities. Appointed to oversee counties, these officers were responsible for tax collection, legal enforcement, and coordination of military obligations. Charters and legal records indicate that sheriffs reported to the exchequer, creating a chain of accountability that linked local administration directly to the crown. This system reduced reliance on personal loyalty of individual lords and standardized governance practices across England, strengthening institutional resilience in both fiscal and judicial matters. Henry's administrative expansion also involved systematic record-keeping and documentation. Land charters, writs, and itinerant justices facilitated oversight of legal and fiscal obligations, while monastic scribes contributed to centralized record maintenance. These measures created a bureaucratic infrastructure capable of supporting long-term governance, ensuring that authority was embedded in procedures rather than contingent upon individual rulers. Archaeological evidence, including royal mints and administrative centers, aligns with textual records, confirming the practical implementation of these reforms. The king's direct engagement with the judiciary further reinforced authority. Henry employed itinerant justices to hear cases across the kingdom, standardizing legal practice and ensuring consistent application of royal law. Court records indicate that decisions were documented and enforced across multiple jurisdictions, demonstrating that governance was extended through procedural mechanisms rather than localized personal influence. This approach also facilitated integration of regional customs with overarching royal authority, creating a coherent framework for legal and fiscal control. Fiscal policy under Henry I extended beyond traditional feudal dues. The crown systematically assessed fines, profits from royal lands, and other forms of revenue to maximize resources for administrative and military purposes. Pipe rolls revealed detailed audits, including the collection of scutage and other monetary obligations, ensuring transparency and enforceability. These practices enhanced royal oversight and allowed the monarchy to fund both domestic governance and external campaigns, demonstrating the interdependence of fiscal and administrative systems in sustaining authority. Henry's administrative model emphasized consistency, accountability, and procedural rigor. By centralizing financial records, deploying itinerant officials, and codifying obligations through charters and writs, the crown established enduring mechanisms for governance that could outlast individual rulers. The combination of exchequer oversight, local administration, and judicial infrastructure created a resilient system capable of maintaining political stability, enforcing law, and integrating diverse regions into a coherent kingdom. Legal reform and institutional expansion under Henry I illustrate that medieval English authority was increasingly embedded in structured systems rather than personal rule. Charters, fiscal records, and administrative correspondence collectively demonstrate a deliberate effort to create measurable, enforceable governance. By consolidating fiscal, legal, and administrative mechanisms, Henry strengthened the monarchy's capacity to project authority, regulate society, and maintain continuity across successive reigns. Legal reform deepened institutional control. Law became the backbone of royal power. Henry II's reign marked a decisive transformation in English governance through the systematic development of legal institutions that reinforced royal authority. Building on administrative foundations established by his predecessors, Henry II introduced circuit courts, itinerant justices, and standardized procedures that extended the crown's reach into localities previously governed primarily by custom or feudal prerogative. Contemporary chronicles, charters, and legal treatises document these reforms, emphasizing their centrality to consolidating authority across a kingdom marked by regional diversity. The introduction of itinerant justices was a key instrument of legal centralization. Judges traveled in circuits, hearing cases in multiple counties, ensuring consistent application of royal law. This innovation reduced reliance on local lords and customary courts, aligning judicial practice with crown policy. Pipe rolls and court records from the period reveal both criminal and civil proceedings under the authority of these itinerant officials, illustrating that the enforcement of justice was increasingly standardized and linked to the monarchy rather than localized power structures. Juries were institutionalized as mechanisms for gathering local knowledge and verifying claims. Early forms of juries, composed of local freeholders or respected community members, provided factual testimony regarding land disputes, property boundaries, and criminal accusations. Records indicate that this system reduced arbitrary adjudication, enhanced procedural fairness, and reinforced the legitimacy of royal courts. The jury system also strengthened administrative oversight, allowing the crown to monitor local conditions and assert authority over both urban and rural communities. Henry II codified and standardized law to ensure uniformity across the kingdom. Existing Anglo-Saxon codes were reconciled with feudal and Norman legal practices, producing a cohesive framework that regulated property, inheritance, criminal activity, and administrative obligations. Textual evidence from legal compilations, such as the Assizes of Clarendon, 1166, and Glanville, demonstrates the systematic documentation of procedures, penalties, and enforcement mechanisms. This codification created a predictable legal environment that facilitated governance, reduced regional variation, and enhanced royal authority. The royal courts became central to economic and political control. By adjudicating disputes over land, inheritance, and obligations, the monarchy asserted dominance over the distribution of property and the enforcement of contracts. Charters and court records indicate that decisions were recorded, enabling appeals and reference for future cases, which contributed to legal continuity and administrative stability. Economic enforcement through fines, amercements, and forfeitures provided both revenue and a mechanism for maintaining order, linking the judicial system directly to fiscal and political governance. Henry II's legal reforms were also integrated with broader administrative structures. Sheriffs, reeves, and local officials were required to cooperate with royal justices, ensuring that procedural consistency extended from the county to the crown. Court sessions were coordinated with fiscal reporting, tax collection, and enforcement of feudal obligations, reflecting the interdependence of legal and administrative systems. Archaeological evidence of court sites, mints, and administrative centers supports textual accounts, confirming the physical infrastructure that enabled the centralized judicial system. Conflict between royal and ecclesiastical authority emerged as legal centralization expanded. Henry II's efforts to assert jurisdiction over clerical crimes, particularly through the constitutions of Clarendon, 1164, challenged the traditional autonomy of church courts. Chronicles document resistance from senior clerics, including Archbishop Thomas Becket, whose eventual martyrdom in 1170 symbolized the tension between secular and religious legal authority. These disputes highlight the delicate balance of asserting royal legal control while maintaining institutional legitimacy, demonstrating that legal centralization was both politically effective and socially contested. By the end of Henry II's reign, common law had become an enduring instrument of royal authority. The integration of itinerant justices, juries, standardized procedures, and codified statutes created a coherent system capable of regulating behavior, adjudicating disputes, and reinforcing fiscal and political control. Legal institutions were no longer peripheral. They were central to the monarchy's ability to project authority, integrate diverse regions, and sustain governance across successive reigns. Legal authority clashed with religious autonomy. Jurisdiction defined sovereignty. The reign of Henry II was marked not only by administrative and legal centralization but also by significant tension between the Crown and the English Church. Central to this conflict was Thomas Becket, appointed Archbishop of Canterbury in 1162. Initially a close ally of Henry II, Becket's elevation was intended to consolidate royal influence over the Church. However, Becket's assertion of ecclesiastical independence, particularly regarding legal jurisdiction over clerical offenders, rapidly brought him into direct conflict with the Crown. Contemporary chronicles, including the Gesta Regis Henrici Secundi and English monastic accounts, document escalating disputes over authority, emphasizing the constitutional and institutional implications of clerical autonomy. Henry II sought to assert royal jurisdiction over clergy accused of secular crimes, codified in the Constitutions of Clarendon, 1164. These ordinances defined the Crown's rights regarding legal processes, land disputes, and appeals, aiming to integrate ecclesiastical officials into the broader judicial and administrative framework. Becket's refusal to comply with these measures exemplified the competing claims of spiritual and temporal authority. The conflict illustrates the centrality of jurisdiction to sovereignty, as both Crown and Church sought control over legal processes, personnel, and enforcement mechanisms. The escalation of the dispute demonstrates the interplay between legal reform and institutional power. Henry's reliance on standardized courts and itinerant justices extended royal authority across England, while Becket invoked ecclesiastical law and papal backing to resist encroachment. Monastic chronicles describe Becket's excommunication of royal officials and his exile to France, 1164 to 1170, highlighting how institutional channels, rather than individual personality, mediated the conflict. This period underscores the limits of administrative centralization when parallel systems of authority, in this case ecclesiastical courts, maintained independent legitimacy. Becket's return to England in 1170 intensified the confrontation. Disputes over clerical trials, landholding, and the legal privileges of the Church escalated into direct confrontation between royal authority and ecclesiastical autonomy. On December 29, 1170, Becket was murdered in Canterbury Cathedral by knights acting in Henry's name, an event recorded in multiple contemporary chronicles, including English, Norman, and papal sources. The assassination produced immediate political and religious repercussions, forcing Henry to perform public penance and negotiate with the papacy to maintain legitimacy. The murder of Becket exemplified the institutional stakes of legal and administrative control. It highlighted that clerical courts were not subordinate to secular authority, and that the Crown's ability to govern effectively required negotiation and compromise with independent institutions. Papal correspondence and ecclesiastical records indicate that the resolution involved both legal recognition of clerical privileges and the acknowledgement of royal rights, establishing a precedent for balancing competing jurisdictions in subsequent reigns. Fiscal implications of the conflict were significant. Clerical lands and revenues were closely tied to administrative oversight and taxation. Disputes over jurisdiction affected the Crown's ability to levy fines, enforce obligations, and integrate ecclesiastical estates into fiscal planning. Pipe rolls and charter evidence reveal that negotiated settlements allowed continued taxation and resource management without undermining the Church's legal privileges, demonstrating the interdependence of legal authority, fiscal control, and institutional accommodation. Becket's martyrdom also had long-term institutional and cultural effects. Pilgrimage to Canterbury Cathedral, veneration of relics, and canonization in 1173 reinforced ecclesiastical authority and public recognition of clerical autonomy. Simultaneously, Henry's administrative and legal reforms persisted, indicating that institutional structures were resilient and adaptable even in the face of crisis. The conflict therefore illustrates the negotiation of power between parallel systems, the integration of legal and fiscal governance, and the enduring importance of institutional checks on sovereign authority. Tensions extended into fiscal governance. War reshaped governance. The period following the reign of Henry III saw England increasingly entangled in continental affairs, culminating in prolonged Anglo-French conflicts that foreshadowed the Hundred Years' War, 1337 to 1453. Initial territorial disputes over Normandy and Gascony, rooted in the Angevin inheritance, created sustained military obligations for the English crown. Chronicles, charters, and administrative records indicate that monarchs, including Edward I and Edward III, faced recurring pressures to raise armies and maintain garrisons abroad. The demands of war exposed the limitations of traditional feudal levies and highlighted the need for systematic financial and administrative mechanisms to sustain military operations. Military campaigns required substantial resources beyond the capacity of localized taxation or feudal obligation. Pipe rolls and exchequer records document increasing reliance on scutage payments, tallages, and loans, often levied on both barons and urban centers. The crown developed standardized procedures to assess contributions, collect payments, and monitor compliance. These fiscal measures were not ad hoc but integrated into the administrative machinery refined under the Angevins, reflecting the growing centralization and professionalization of governance in response to sustained military pressures. The logistics of war extended beyond troop mobilization. England's campaigns in France necessitated the provisioning of ships, weapons, and supplies, coordinated through regional and royal administration. Port towns such as Portsmouth and Southampton became nodes of organization, with charters and maritime records detailing levies for transport, shipbuilding, and provisioning. Military finance thus required an integration of local, regional, and royal authorities, demonstrating how extended warfare drove institutional adaptation. Archaeological evidence, including remains of fortifications, docks, and arms caches, confirms the material infrastructure supporting these operations. The fiscal strain of military campaigns also reinforced the development of parliamentary oversight. Monarchs increasingly summoned assemblies of barons and clergy to authorize extraordinary taxation. Records of parliamentary writs and petitions show that consent for levies was frequently negotiated, with representatives discussing rates, exemptions, and accountability measures. These gatherings laid the groundwork for evolving institutional representation, linking fiscal necessity with emergent legislative practices. Representation was not yet formalized in a modern sense, but these negotiations signaled a shift toward consultation and accountability in fiscal governance. Economic pressures extended into urban centers and rural communities. Towns were assessed for contributions proportional to their wealth, often tied to trade, markets, and production. Pipe rolls indicate careful documentation of obligations, collection, and arrears, highlighting both administrative efficiency and the crown's growing reliance on record-keeping. Similarly, rural taxation was coordinated through hundreds and shires, reflecting continuity with older administrative structures while adapting to the fiscal demands of prolonged warfare. These systems allowed the crown to sustain operations abroad while maintaining domestic order. Military finance also prompted innovation in borrowing and credit. Monarchs drew on loans from Italian banking networks, Jewish financiers, and wealthy barons to supplement revenues from taxation. Letters, financial rolls, and legal documents demonstrate the formalization of debt agreements, repayment schedules, and collateral, illustrating the integration of fiscal strategy into broader administrative governance. This reliance on borrowing connected domestic financial institutions with international markets, reflecting the increasingly complex economic dimensions of warfare. The demands of military finance further affected the crown's authority and negotiation with elites. Barons and local officials leveraged the necessity of taxation to secure concessions, privileges, and legal recognition. Charters and parliamentary records document negotiated exemptions, land grants, and adjustments to obligations, reflecting the balance of coercion and consent necessary to maintain legitimacy. The interdependence of military necessity, fiscal administration, and political negotiation demonstrates how prolonged conflict reshaped governance structures, linking resource mobilization to institutional development. By the mid-14th century, sustained Anglo-French engagement had transformed English administrative capacity. Military finance necessitated formalized taxation, auditing, and coordination between royal officials, urban centers, and regional authorities. Pipe rolls, charters, and parliamentary writs illustrate the development of mechanisms to monitor revenue, enforce obligations, and plan campaigns, establishing enduring systems that extended beyond immediate wartime needs. This integration of fiscal, legal, and administrative authority strengthened the monarchy while embedding accountability into governance. Finance required representation. Representation followed revenue. The growing fiscal demands of prolonged military campaigns and administrative expansion catalyzed the institutional evolution of the English Parliament. Initially convened as advisory councils, assemblies of barons, clergy, and later representatives from towns gradually acquired authority to consent to taxation. Records from writs, parliamentary rolls, and chronicles indicate that monarchs such as Edward I and Edward III increasingly relied on these assemblies to authorize extraordinary levies, formalizing a relationship between fiscal necessity and political consultation. These developments established Parliament not merely as a forum for advice but as a mechanism through which the Crown negotiated financial support with political elites. Parliamentary sessions became structured around the Crown's need to secure revenue. The Model Parliament of 1295 under Edward I exemplifies the integration of broader representation, including knights of the shires and burgesses from towns, into fiscal decision-making. Charters and parliamentary writs confirm that this assembly approved taxes while allowing members to petition for grievances, illustrating the emergence of a dual function: authorization of revenue and negotiation of rights and privileges. The Crown's dependence on consent institutionalized accountability, creating a precedent for the formalization of parliamentary authority over taxation. Negotiation in Parliament reflected the balance of power between monarch and subjects. Barons and urban representatives leveraged taxation consent to secure concessions on legal, economic, and social matters. For instance, recorded petitions frequently requested protection of trade, exemption from certain dues, or confirmation of charters. These negotiations demonstrate that fiscal authority became entwined with political bargaining, reinforcing the principle that revenue collection was conditional upon consent and institutional consultation rather than unilateral imposition. The administration of parliamentary taxation was supported by existing fiscal mechanisms. Exchequer records, pipe rolls, and local audits facilitated the assessment, collection, and reporting of approved levies. Representatives conveyed regional capacities and compliance to royal officials, ensuring that taxes were aligned with economic realities. The integration of parliamentary consent with bureaucratic oversight strengthened both fiscal efficiency and political legitimacy, linking governance structures directly to the monarchy's capacity to fund campaigns and administer the kingdom. The evolution of Parliament also reinforced legal and institutional norms. Debates and petitions often addressed issues of property rights, judicial procedure, and administrative obligations, creating a record of precedent and negotiation. Chroniclers and administrative records reveal that discussions in Parliament contributed to the codification of practice, with agreements ratified by royal writ or statute. This process enhanced the predictability of governance, establishing a formalized relationship between the Crown and its subjects that extended beyond immediate fiscal needs. Economic and military pressures accelerated parliamentary influence. Recurrent conflicts in France, including the early phases of the Hundred Years' War, and domestic fiscal challenges required the Crown to secure extraordinary levies efficiently. Writs and parliamentary rolls indicate that approval of taxation became conditional upon consultation with regional representatives, solidifying the expectation that monarchs could not unilaterally impose extraordinary financial demands. Over time, this practice institutionalized parliamentary consent as a cornerstone of English governance, embedding negotiation into fiscal policy. Urban representation contributed to the broader evolution of Parliament. Towns and boroughs provided both revenue and political input, with representatives articulating commercial interests, tax capacity, and obligations. Records from borough writs indicate that negotiations included assessment of tolls, trade regulation, and resource allocation, integrating urban economic activity into the parliamentary framework. This broadened the base of consultation beyond the nobility, enhancing the crown's understanding of regional capacities while institutionalizing a representative element in fiscal governance. By the mid-14th century, parliamentary consultation was integral to political and fiscal stability. Assemblies mediated the crown's authority, balancing revenue demands with the recognition of local and elite rights. The dual function of parliament, as a source of fiscal authorization and political negotiation, demonstrates the interdependence of governance, finance, and institutional development. Procedures established during this period laid the foundation for the evolution of representative institutions in subsequent centuries. Economic strain intensified social pressure. Crisis preceded catastrophe. The agrarian economy of medieval England during the 13th and early 14th centuries experienced mounting pressures that strained social, economic, and political systems. Population growth, which had accelerated since the late 12th century, increased demand for arable land, pasture, and resources. Pipe rolls, manorial records, and tax assessments reveal that many regions approached the limits of productive capacity, with smaller holdings, marginal land exploitation, and intensified tenancy obligations reflecting widespread pressure on the rural economy. This demographic expansion produced both structural stress and localized vulnerability to famine. Land use patterns evolved to accommodate population demands. Open field systems predominated, with three-field rotation and communal management maximizing output on arable land. Archaeological evidence, including ridge and furrow patterns and settlement surveys, demonstrates widespread cultivation of previously marginal land, encroachment into woodlands, and reorganization of tenancies to increase productivity. These adjustments, however, often increased vulnerability to climatic fluctuations, soil exhaustion, and over-reliance on staple crops, creating systemic fragility in the food supply. Famine episodes illustrate the interconnection between demographic pressure, environmental conditions, and agrarian organization. Records from manorial accounts, chronicles, and tax rolls indicate crop failures in the 1310s, particularly during the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317. Poor harvests, excessive rainfall, and subsequent disease outbreaks led to localized shortages, price inflation, and increased mortality. The administrative response relied on existing structures, including royal requisitions, market regulation, and charitable relief, yet these measures were often insufficient to prevent widespread social stress. These episodes exposed the limits of agrarian resilience and the dependency of rural populations on stable production cycles. Economic stratification intensified under these conditions. Tenants, cottagers, and laborers bore the brunt of scarcity, while landlords and monasteries often maintained land holdings and surplus production. Manorial rolls document disputes over rents, customary labor services, and access to common resources, revealing tensions between elite extraction and subsistence needs. The unequal distribution of land and productivity pressures contributed to social stress, periodic unrest, and negotiations over customary rights, setting the stage for later legal and social interventions. Market integration and trade partially mitigated local shortages. Regional markets, fairs, and long-distance exchange allowed for redistribution of grain, livestock, and essential goods. Financial records, including toll and customs accounts, illustrate the reliance of urban and rural communities on these networks, as well as the Crown's increasing interest in regulating commerce to ensure supply stability. Nonetheless, the effectiveness of these systems was limited by transport constraints, climatic variability, and the localized nature of agricultural production, leaving populations vulnerable to shocks. Administrative and fiscal structures reflected the connection between agrarian stress and governance. Taxation based on yield, such as tallages and feudal dues, continued even during periods of scarcity, placing additional strain on tenants and smallholders. Pipe rolls and exchequer records demonstrate that enforcement of obligations persisted, illustrating the resilience of institutional mechanisms but also the potential for social friction. Disputes over payment, labor service, and resource allocation frequently required adjudication in manorial or royal courts, integrating agrarian stress into broader administrative and legal frameworks. Population pressure also affected landholding patterns and settlement distribution. Smaller holdings, subdivision of tenancies, and encroachment into peripheral lands intensified competition for arable and pastoral space. Archaeological surveys show expansion into marginal soils, reorganization of villages, and increased clearance of woodlands, highlighting both adaptive strategies and ecological limits. These changes contributed to systemic vulnerability, as environmental variability or disease could produce cascading effects on production, subsistence, and social stability. By the mid-14th century, the cumulative effects of demographic growth, famine, and structural pressure had left the English agrarian system vulnerable to external shocks. Chroniclers and manorial records emphasize persistent shortages, rising food prices, and local unrest, indicating that population and economic stress intersected with administrative and fiscal structures. The kingdom entered 1348 with an agrarian economy already under considerable strain, primed for dramatic disruption. Environmental shock accelerated systemic change. Demography changed faster than institutions. The arrival of the Black Death in England in 1348 precipitated one of the most profound demographic crises in medieval European history. Introduced through maritime trade routes from continental Europe, the Yersinia pestis bacterium spread rapidly along towns, rivers, and transport networks. Contemporary chronicles, including those of Jean Froissart and the London Chronicle, document the sudden onset of fever, buboes, and high mortality, while manorial records, tax assessments, and ecclesiastical registers corroborate dramatic population decline. Estimates suggest that between 1/3 and 1/2 of England's population perished within 2 to 3 years, fundamentally altering social, economic, and political structures. Urban centers experienced acute mortality, as dense populations facilitated rapid transmission. Cities such as London, York, and Norwich recorded significant population loss, with parish registers showing mass burials and dramatic declines in taxable households. Archaeological evidence, including plague pits and mass burial sites, confirms these historical accounts, providing tangible proof of widespread mortality. Beyond immediate human loss, the Black Death disrupted trade, municipal administration, and urban production, creating cascading effects on food supply, labor allocation, and fiscal stability. Rural areas were similarly devastated. Manorial rolls indicate that entire villages suffered depopulation, reducing agricultural output and challenging traditional land management systems. Fields were left fallow, common lands underutilized, and livestock herds diminished due to the scarcity of laborers. The reduction in population resulted in labor shortages, undermining customary obligations and compelling landlords to offer higher wages or modify tenure arrangements. Archaeological surveys and land use studies demonstrate changes in settlement patterns, with abandoned or downsized villages reflecting the demographic shock. The mortality of clergy, officials, and skilled workers compounded institutional strain. Ecclesiastical records document the rapid replacement of parish priests and monastic officials, often with inexperienced or less educated clergy, affecting literacy, record-keeping, and local administration. Royal and manorial bureaucracy faced similar disruptions, as experienced administrators, clerks, and tax collectors succumbed to the plague. These personnel losses slowed governance, reduced efficiency in revenue collection, and increased reliance on emergent local elites or inexperienced replacements. Economic consequences were immediate and profound. Labor scarcity led to rising wages, documented in manorial accounts and wage ordinances, as landlords competed to secure workers. Conversely, urban artisans and merchants faced interruptions in production and trade, reducing output and creating market instability. Royal Exchequer records indicate a decline in revenue due to decreased taxation bases, highlighting the fiscal impact of demographic collapse. These shifts fundamentally challenged the pre-existing balance between labor, land, and fiscal obligations, generating both short-term disruption and longer-term structural change. The social fabric was strained by fear, uncertainty, and mobility. Survivors often sought better wages, abandoned customary obligations, or migrated to less affected regions. Parish records and manorial petitions reveal tensions between landlords and tenants, disputes over customary dues, and attempts to enforce traditional obligations despite diminished labor capacity. This instability foreshadowed subsequent legal interventions, such as the Ordinance of Laborers, 1349, which attempted to regulate wages and labor mobility, illustrating the immediate institutional response to demographic crisis. The Black Death also had lasting implications for mortality patterns and inheritance. With high death rates across multiple generations, property succession, landholding patterns, and demographic structures were disrupted. Charters, inheritance records, and manorial surveys indicate that widows, heirs, and orphan children often assumed new responsibilities, shifting the social composition of rural and urban communities. These demographic changes contributed to evolving economic and legal frameworks, as customary practices were challenged and adapted to reflect new realities. Regional variation in plague impact further shaped governance and social response. Southern and eastern counties, more densely populated and better connected to continental trade, experienced earlier and more severe outbreaks, while western and northern regions faced delayed but no less catastrophic mortality. Localized differences in mortality affected labor negotiations, food supply, and administrative capacity, creating a patchwork of recovery and adjustment that persisted for decades. Archaeological and textual evidence demonstrates that recovery was uneven, with depopulation influencing settlement patterns, land use, and institutional adaptation. By 1351, England's population had declined dramatically, leaving a kingdom with drastically reduced labor resources, disrupted administration, and destabilized social hierarchies. The immediate response efforts to regulate wages, reassert obligations, and maintain fiscal revenue revealed that institutions struggled to adapt as rapidly as demographic conditions shifted. The Black Death thus exemplifies how population collapse can outpace institutional capacity, producing systemic strain that redefined labor, economy, and governance. Labor relations destabilized. Lowell resisted economic reality. The demographic collapse caused by the Black Death created unprecedented labor shortages across England, generating pressure for higher wages and greater mobility among surviving workers. Landlords and authorities, however, sought to stabilize production and control costs, leading to legislative interventions designed to restrict labor mobility and regulate wages. The Statute of Laborers of 1349 and its subsequent revisions codified these measures, attempting to enforce pre-plague economic norms despite the scarcity of labor. Contemporary records, including royal statutes, manorial accounts, and court rolls, provide evidence of widespread enforcement efforts and social tension generated by these regulations. The Statute of Laborers mandated that workers accept wages fixed at pre-plague levels, prohibited excessive demands, and restricted migration between manors without consent. Local officials, including sheriffs and justices of the peace, were charged with monitoring compliance and adjudicating disputes, creating a legal framework that tied laborers to traditional obligations. Manorial court records reveal both prosecutions and petitions, illustrating that enforcement was uneven and often contested. The legislation reflects the Crown's attempt to maintain economic stability and fiscal predictability in the face of rapidly changing demographic and market conditions. The statute had broader economic implications. Attempts to suppress wages conflicted with market forces, as employers faced limited labor supply and workers could command higher compensation. Chroniclers, account rolls, and petitions from the period document tensions between landowners and tenants, with laborers sometimes refusing work or migrating to areas offering better terms. These pressures forced landlords and officials to negotiate or adapt enforcement pragmatically, highlighting the limits of statutory authority when confronted with demographic and economic realities. Regional variation in enforcement was significant. In areas with severe depopulation, such as eastern counties and the Midlands, laborers could leverage scarcity to secure concessions, while in less affected regions, authorities successfully imposed wage restrictions. Manorial and county records document fines, appeals, and exemptions, indicating that the statute functioned both as a legal instrument and as a tool for negotiation. These discrepancies underscore the interplay between legislation, economic conditions, and local power structures, demonstrating that statutory control was mediated by context and compliance capacity. The statute of laborers also intersected with urban economies. Towns and boroughs, reliant on artisans, merchants, and skilled labor, faced similar labor shortages and rising costs. Municipal charters, guild regulations, and civic records reveal efforts to regulate wages, control apprenticeship practices, and stabilize trade. Urban enforcement mechanisms often paralleled rural statutes, reinforcing a coordinated attempt to manage labor markets and maintain social order, though with mixed effectiveness. The urban experience highlights the broader economic reach of post-plague legislation and the integration of multiple levels of governance in economic regulation. Resistance to wage control became increasingly pronounced, particularly as legal enforcement struggled to match economic pressures. Petitions, rebellions, and localized unrest demonstrate that statutory authority could not fully suppress labor bargaining or migration. These tensions contributed to a climate of social strain that intersected with fiscal, legal, and political systems. Contemporary chronicles describe sporadic uprisings and disputes over customary rights, illustrating the societal impact of enforcing laws at odds with market realities. The Crown's motivation for labor regulation extended beyond economic control. Fixed wages and restricted mobility helped stabilize rents, service obligations, and fiscal revenue from manorial estates, ensuring continuity of royal income. Pipe rolls, exchequer records, and manorial surveys indicate that authorities monitored compliance to protect both economic and administrative interests. The statute of laborers thus functioned as a tool of governance, linking economic regulation to broader administrative and fiscal priorities. By the late 14th century, the statute of laborers had produced both adaptation and resistance. While some localities maintained compliance through legal enforcement and negotiation, other areas experienced labor mobility, wage inflation, and social tension. The legislation highlighted the limits of top-down authority in responding to systemic demographic and economic change, revealing the tensions between legal prescription and market forces. These dynamics set the stage for subsequent political mobilization and organized resistance. Resistance became political. Social order was challenged, not overturned. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 represented a pivotal moment in late medieval England, arising from the intersection of demographic pressure, economic strain, and fiscal impositions. The Black Death had reduced the labor force, leading to higher wages and mobility among peasants, while legislative measures such as the Statute of Laborers attempted to restrict these new economic freedoms. Additionally, heavy taxation to fund ongoing conflicts, particularly the third poll tax, fueled resentment among rural and urban populations alike. Contemporary chronicles, including those of Thomas Walsingham and the Anonymous Chronicle of London, detail the rapid escalation of grievances into organized resistance, providing insight into both causes and local dynamics. The revolt began in Essex and Kent, where communities resisted tax collectors and organized armed protest. Local grievances included unfair rents, feudal obligations, and perceived corruption among officials. Peasant leaders, most prominently Wat Tyler and John Ball, articulated demands that combined economic relief with broader challenges to social hierarchy, calling for the reduction of feudal obligations and reform of local administration. While chroniclers often emphasize disorder and violence, manorial records and petitions reveal that participants pursued both redress of specific grievances and a reassertion of communal rights within existing structures. The movement quickly expanded to London, where rebels entered the city, destroyed symbols of authority, and captured officials. Administrative records show that the monarchy, led by Richard II, initially engaged directly with rebel leaders, promising concessions to defuse immediate conflict. These negotiations reflect the Crown's recognition of the structural pressures driving unrest and the need to maintain legitimacy in the face of widespread dissatisfaction. The revolt's urban dimension underscored the connection between fiscal policy, labor regulation, and governance, highlighting vulnerabilities in both rural and urban administration. Violence was concentrated on property and officials rather than wholesale social destruction. Rebels targeted manorial centers, tax offices, and urban officials responsible for implementing unpopular policies, while sparing churches and broader civic infrastructure. Archaeological surveys and contemporary accounts corroborate selective destruction, indicating that participants were strategic rather than indiscriminate. This pattern demonstrates that the revolt aimed to contest authority and fiscal practices, rather than to overthrow the monarchy or entirely dismantle social hierarchy. The Crown's response combined negotiation, military action, and legal suppression. Richard II's initial concessions, including promises to abolish poll taxes and relieve feudal burdens, temporarily pacified rebels, but these were later rescinded once royal forces reasserted control. Chronicles and legal records document trials, executions, and property confiscations, illustrating the dual strategy of deterrence and reassertion of authority. These measures reinforced the principle that challenges to governance would be contained, while simultaneously acknowledging the structural pressures that precipitated the revolt. Economic and administrative consequences were significant. Manorial accounts, tax records, and royal correspondence indicate temporary disruptions in revenue collection, labor allocation, and local governance. The revolt exposed vulnerabilities in labor regulation, taxation policy, and local administration, prompting adjustments in enforcement practices, negotiation with tenants, and recalibration of fiscal expectations. Although the immediate social hierarchy remained intact, the events influenced long-term interactions between landlords, laborers, and the crown, shaping subsequent policy and governance strategies. Interpretive analysis emphasizes that the revolt reflected systemic pressures rather than spontaneous disorder. Population decline, labor shortages, fiscal impositions, and uneven enforcement of statutory law created conditions conducive to organized resistance. While leadership and mobilization were essential, the underlying causes were structural, highlighting the interaction of economic, demographic, and legal factors in late medieval governance. The revolt thus serves as a case study in how institutional rigidity, when confronted with social and economic change, can provoke political mobilization and contestation. Regional variation influenced both causes and outcomes. Southern counties, particularly Essex and Kent, were heavily affected by both plague-induced labor scarcity and high tax burdens, facilitating organized resistance. Other regions experienced localized disturbances but did not mobilize on the scale seen in the southeast. This uneven distribution illustrates that social unrest was contingent on a combination of demographic pressure, fiscal policy, and administrative enforcement, rather than a uniform national crisis. By the end of 1381, the peasants' revolt had been suppressed, but its consequences persisted. Legal and administrative adaptations were uneven. Authorities enforced compliance, yet they also recognized the need to accommodate shifting labor dynamics and economic realities. Chroniclers and royal records show a balance between coercion and pragmatic adjustment, indicating that governance evolved in response to social pressure while maintaining core hierarchical structures. Late medieval governance adapted unevenly. Authority weakened from within. The Lancastrian period, beginning with Henry IV's accession in 1399, was marked by contested legitimacy and persistent fiscal weakness. Henry IV seized the throne from Richard II, initiating a dynasty whose authority rested on usurpation rather than hereditary consensus. Chronicles, including the Westminster Chronicle and the Anonymous Chronicle of London, emphasized the fragility of royal prerogative during this period, highlighting rebellions such as the Percy Uprisings, 1403 to 1408, and the revolt of Owain Glyndwr in Wales, 1400 to 1415. These challenges strained resources, undermined royal authority, and demanded constant military expenditure, exposing structural weaknesses in both governance and revenue generation. Financial administration during the Lancastrian reign struggled to meet the demands of war, governance, and debt repayment. Pipe rolls and exchequer records demonstrate chronic deficits, reliance on extraordinary levies, and inconsistent collection of customary dues. Scutage, subsidies, and forced loans were used to fund military campaigns, but enforcement proved uneven, and compliance often required negotiation with barons and regional officials. The crown's fiscal vulnerability limited its ability to project authority, both domestically and abroad, while reinforcing dependence on political elites whose support was conditional and often opportunistic. Henry V's reign temporarily stabilized Lancastrian authority through military success, most notably at the Battle of Agincourt, 1415. Campaigns in France generated short-term prestige, enhanced royal legitimacy, and brought financial rewards through plunder, ransoms, and territorial claims. However, Edwardian exchequer records indicate that sustaining occupation forces and administering conquered territories imposed continuing fiscal burdens. Military success did not eliminate structural weaknesses, and the crown remained dependent on parliamentary subsidies and baronial cooperation to maintain campaigns and governance. Henry VI's minority and eventual personal incapacity exacerbated fiscal and administrative fragility. The regency councils, intended to manage governance during his youth, faced competing interests, factional rivalries, and persistent financial shortfalls. Chronicles and legal documents revealed delayed payments to officials, arrears in garrisons, and mismanagement of revenue, highlighting the limits of administrative structures in maintaining consistent authority. Regional magnates, such as the Duke of Gloucester and Cardinal Beaufort, exercised significant autonomy, reflecting the decentralized nature of late medieval governance under a weak monarch. Legitimacy concerns intensified structural challenges. The Lancastrian claim to the throne, based on male line descent through John of Gaunt, was contested by descendants of Richard II and the House of York. Genealogical debates, parliamentary petitions, and contemporary chroniclers emphasized the fragile nature of dynastic authority, encouraging barons to assert influence and engage in factional maneuvering. The crown's weakened legitimacy complicated fiscal administration, as enforcement of taxation and obligations depended on voluntary compliance by elites and communities skeptical of royal prerogative. Economic stress compounded political fragility. Continued military campaigns, social unrest, and the need to maintain garrisons placed heavy demands on royal revenue. Manorial accounts, urban tax rolls, and customs records indicate that fiscal extraction was uneven and often contentious. Barons leveraged financial dependence to negotiate privileges, exemptions, or appointments, reinforcing the crown's reliance on negotiation rather than coercion. This dynamic highlights the interconnection between fiscal weakness, legitimacy, and the capacity to govern effectively in late medieval England. The combination of contested legitimacy, fiscal insufficiency, and decentralized authority created conditions for escalating factionalism. Regional magnates, acting as both military leaders and administrators, exercised considerable power in localities, sometimes challenging or circumventing royal directives. Parliamentary petitions, legal disputes, and correspondence reveal tensions between central authority and local autonomy, illustrating how structural weaknesses in governance enabled competing interests to assert influence, undermining cohesion across the kingdom. By the early 1450s, Lancastrian governance faced chronic instability. Continuous demands on revenue, coupled with weakened royal authority and factional rivalries, diminished the crown's capacity to enforce law, defend borders, or maintain domestic order. Chroniclers and administrative records indicate a cycle of fiscal strain, political negotiation, and local autonomy that defined the period. Authority weakened from within, setting the stage for broader dynastic conflict and civil war. Factionalism escalated. Civil war reflected elite competition. The Wars of the Roses, spanning from 1455 to 1485, were rooted in dynastic rivalry between the Lancastrian and Yorkist houses, but structurally they reflected deeper tensions in late medieval governance and noble power. England's monarchy had been weakened by fiscal weakness, contested legitimacy, and factionalism, creating an environment in which elite families could assert military and political influence. Chronicles such as those by Gregory, Warkworth, and Hall, alongside parliamentary petitions and legal records, document intermittent outbreaks of armed conflict, regional control shifts, and strategic alliances, emphasizing the centrality of noble ambition in shaping civil war dynamics. Initial confrontations, including the First Battle of St. Albans, 1455, demonstrate how personal grievances, competing claims to offices, and control over local resources could ignite national conflict. Nobles leveraged private retinues, fortified estates, and regional networks to assert authority, often independent of royal direction. Manorial and legal records indicate that baronial households maintained armed followers capable of rapid mobilization, effectively functioning as regional power centers. The crown's limited fiscal and military capacity meant that royal intervention was often reactive rather than proactive, further empowering elite actors. The conflict was characterized by cycles of battle, negotiation, and temporary settlement. Key engagements, including the battles of Toten, 1461, Barnet, 1471, and Bosworth, 1485, demonstrate that military outcomes frequently depended on coalition building and local loyalty rather than purely dynastic legitimacy. Roles of retainers, muster records, and contemporary chroniclers highlight the role of private armies, patronage networks, and strategic marriages in shaping political outcomes. These dynamics reflect a structural feature of late medieval England, the interdependence of royal authority and noble power, where civil conflict arose when equilibrium between these forces broke down. Economic and administrative pressures reinforced noble influence. The crown's reliance on subsidies, loans, and local enforcement to fund campaigns made barons critical to sustaining military operations. Exchequer records, pipe rolls, and parliamentary petitions document the crown's dependence on regional magnates for both fiscal and logistical support. This dependence allowed nobles to negotiate concessions, exemptions, and office appointments in return for military service, embedding a transactional element into governance that both facilitated and prolonged civil conflict. The Wars of the Roses also disrupted local governance and legal administration. Chroniclers and manorial surveys note that regions under contested control experienced interruptions in tax collection, law enforcement, and dispute resolution. Nobles exercising de facto authority in their territories often adjudicated disputes independently, reinforcing their autonomy while challenging central authority. The conflict thereby highlighted structural weaknesses in the crown's capacity to maintain consistent governance across the kingdom. Dynastic claims intertwined with factional politics, further complicating the conflict. Yorkist and Lancastrian pretenders invoked genealogy, marriage alliances, and parliamentary sanction to legitimize their claims, but success often depended on noble support rather than institutional endorsement. Legal instruments, including letters patent and parliamentary statutes, reveal attempts to consolidate legitimacy through formal mechanisms, yet military capability and regional loyalty remained decisive. This interplay underscores the limited authority of institutions in the absence of effective centralized power. By the late 1480s, the culmination of civil war with the Battle of Bosworth and Henry VII's accession marked the end of open dynastic conflict. The Yorkist defeat, documented in royal chronicles, financial accounts, and legal acts, signaled the beginning of institutional consolidation. Henry VII leveraged his victory to reinforce fiscal, administrative, and dynastic authority, integrating former rival magnates into a restructured governance framework. While elite competition persisted, the crown's strengthened institutional capacity reduced the likelihood of repeated large-scale civil war. Resolution required institutional stabilization. Medieval monarchy ended through succession, not collapse. Richard III's reign represents the final phase of late medieval English kingship, characterized by contested legitimacy, concentrated royal authority, and a volatile political landscape. Ascending the throne in 1483 following the death of his brother Edward IV and the controversial disappearance of his nephews, the princes in the Tower, Richard's rule highlighted the fragility of dynastic succession and the reliance of medieval monarchy on elite support. Chronicles, including those of Polydore Virgil and later Tudor accounts, detail Richard's administrative actions, political maneuvers, and efforts to consolidate authority, revealing both continuity and tension within late medieval governance. Richard III pursued a policy of centralized administration, reinforcing royal prerogatives and asserting direct control over fiscal and legal mechanisms. Exchequer records, parliamentary petitions, and council proceedings indicate that he sought to stabilize revenue collection, oversee local governance through commissions, and enforce law in contested regions. These measures reflect an understanding of monarchy as both an institutional and personal authority, dependent on effective administration and the loyalty of magnates to sustain legitimacy. Despite administrative initiatives, Richard's reign faced persistent challenges to legitimacy. His accession bypassed Edward IV's heirs, provoking Yorkist dissent and undermining broader acceptance among the nobility. Legal instruments, proclamations, and parliamentary records illustrate attempts to justify his succession, including the Titulus Regius, which declared his claim lawful. Nevertheless, factionalism and elite opposition continued, demonstrating that medieval kingship remained contingent on aristocratic support and the perception of rightful inheritance. Richard's military preparations further underscored the link between kingship and elite power. Facing the combined threat of Henry Tudor's Lancastrian claim and disaffected Yorkists, Richard mobilized forces drawn from loyal retainers and regional strongholds. Muster rolls, correspondence, and chronicles record the composition, deployment, and logistics of his army, highlighting both the operational capabilities of late medieval monarchy and the limitations imposed by prior civil conflict and depleted magnate networks. Military authority thus remained inseparable from political legitimacy and personal loyalty. The decisive confrontation at the Battle of Bosworth in 1485 marked both the end of Richard III's reign and the close of medieval English monarchy as traditionally conceived. Contemporary accounts describe the battlefield events, defections among key supporters, and the death of Richard, demonstrating that succession disputes rather than systemic institutional failure determined the regime's end. The defeat illustrates the vulnerability of monarchy that relied heavily on personal authority and elite allegiance rather than fully institutionalized mechanisms of succession or governance. Richard III's governance and downfall reveal the limits of late medieval kingship. While he enacted legal, fiscal, and administrative reforms designed to strengthen royal authority, these measures were insufficient to offset challenges posed by contested legitimacy, elite factionalism, and military confrontation. Exchequer accounts, parliamentary petitions, and regional correspondence demonstrate the interplay of structural authority and personal power, highlighting that medieval monarchy was effective only insofar as it commanded both institutional compliance and elite loyalty. The transition following Bosworth also emphasizes continuity in governance alongside dynastic change. Henry VII's accession did not dismantle existing administrative structures. Rather, he adapted fiscal, legal, and military institutions to consolidate authority under the Tudor dynasty. Records indicate retention of key officials, continued use of exchequer systems, and the integration of former magnates into a stabilized framework. Richard III's fall thus illustrates the end of an era in monarchy without the collapse of administrative or legal systems, paving the way for the early modern consolidation of royal power. A new political era emerged. Institutions outlived dynasties. The conclusion of the Wars of the Roses and the accession of Henry VII in 1485 marked the beginning of Tudor rule, but the transition was characterized not by institutional collapse, but by continuity. Legal, fiscal, and parliamentary structures established during the late medieval period persisted and adapted to the new dynasty. Exchequer records, parliamentary rolls, and royal charters illustrate that taxation, debt management, and administrative procedures remained largely intact, allowing Henry VII to consolidate authority without dismantling the frameworks inherited from Lancastrian and Yorkist predecessors. Royal administration retained its reliance on both centralized and local mechanisms. The exchequer continued to process revenue from taxation, feudal dues, and fines, while regional sheriffs and justices of the peace enforced royal directives. Manorial surveys and county accounts demonstrate that established methods of record-keeping and fiscal oversight facilitated continuity of governance, even as the crown strengthened oversight through royal councils and household departments. These mechanisms reflected the structural sophistication of late medieval administration, providing the Tudor monarchy with a stable foundation for policy implementation. Parliamentary structures likewise demonstrated resilience and adaptation. Henry VII convened parliaments primarily to secure taxation and legal sanction, continuing the precedent established during the 14th and 15th centuries. Parliamentary rolls indicate that procedures for petitioning, legislation, and taxation remained consistent, emphasizing continuity in institutional practice. The integration of regional elites through parliamentary engagement reinforced centralized authority while respecting established local hierarchies, reflecting an ongoing balance between crown and subject that had developed over the course of the late medieval period. Legal institutions also persisted, facilitating governance and social order. Common law courts, including the King's Bench and Court of Common Pleas, continued to adjudicate civil and criminal matters, while local manorial courts enforced customary law. Royal commissions and writs maintained central oversight, ensuring that legal continuity supported both fiscal and administrative objectives. This continuity underscores that medieval law was not merely ceremonial. It constituted a durable framework that survived dynastic change and underpinned Tudor consolidation. Fiscal mechanisms, particularly taxation and feudal obligations, retained operational relevance. The Crown collected subsidies, customs duties, and fines using established administrative channels. Pipe rolls, exchequer accounts, and local tax assessments illustrate that these systems required minimal structural overhaul, enabling Henry VII to generate revenue efficiently for both domestic governance and foreign policy. This continuity demonstrates that institutional frameworks, rather than dynastic personalities, were crucial for sustaining effective government. The endurance of these institutions also facilitated political stability. By relying on established procedures, Henry VII mitigated the potential for unrest among the nobility and gentry, many of whom had been active during the Wars of the Roses. Administrative consistency, coupled with strategic marriages and patronage, reinforced elite cooperation while maintaining the functionality of governance. Institutional continuity thus provided both the structural means and the social legitimacy necessary for the early Tudor state to consolidate authority. Legacy extended beyond governance. Medieval structures adapted rather than vanished. The social and economic landscape of England experienced significant transformation in the post-medieval period, yet these changes largely evolved from existing late medieval structures. Landholding patterns, labor relations, and social mobility reflected adaptations to demographic shifts, economic pressures, and institutional continuity rather than wholesale disruption. Manorial surveys, court rolls, and property records from the late 15th and early 16th centuries illustrate that feudal tenure persisted alongside emerging forms of leasehold and rental arrangements, highlighting a gradual evolution in land management. Labor relations were similarly shaped by structural continuity. The demographic disruptions of the 14th century, including the Black Death, had increased the bargaining power of laborers, and while post-1485 economic recovery stabilized population levels, labor obligations and customary rights remained integral to rural society. Estate accounts and manorial records reveal that wages and service obligations adjusted incrementally to market conditions, reflecting a balance between landlord authority and tenant agency. This adaptive approach allowed social hierarchies to remain recognizable while accommodating changing economic realities. Urban economies also demonstrated continuity and gradual transformation. Towns continued to rely on guilds for regulation of trade, apprenticeship, and quality control. Civic charters and guild records show that artisans and merchants maintained influence within urban governance, while market integration expanded through trade networks linking England to the Low Countries and the Iberian Peninsula. These developments underscore that economic growth and diversification occurred within established institutional frameworks rather than replacing them, reinforcing the resilience of medieval economic structures. Social mobility increased modestly as a consequence of economic and demographic shifts. Survivors of the Black Death and subsequent generations could acquire land, enter trades, or leverage marital alliances to improve status. Legal documents, wills, and property transfers indicate that both rural and urban households could consolidate resources, secure leases, or gain access to positions of influence. This mobility, while limited, illustrates that social structures were adaptable and capable of absorbing demographic and economic change without destabilizing overall hierarchy. The crown and regional elites played a key role in shaping these adaptations. Royal oversight through commissions, judicial mechanisms, and fiscal regulation guided the redistribution of resources, while local magnates managed customary obligations and land tenure. Administrative records, including exchequer documents and manorial court rolls, reveal that these actors relied on established procedures to enforce compliance, adjudicate disputes, and facilitate economic recovery. By embedding adaptation within institutional practice, England's social and economic systems maintained stability while accommodating change. Cultural and economic continuity extended into legal and fiscal practice. Customary law continued to govern disputes over inheritance, land tenure, and labor obligations, while taxation systems, including subsidies and fines, preserved administrative consistency. These mechanisms provided the structural support necessary for both economic adaptation and social stability, demonstrating that transformations were evolutionary rather than revolutionary. Interpretation shaped understanding. History remains provisional. The study of medieval England has undergone continual reinterpretation, shaped by evolving methodologies, new evidence, and critical historiographical debate. Traditional narratives emphasized political dynasties, warfare, and elite actions, relying heavily on chronicles, legal documents, and literary sources. Modern scholarship, however, integrates archaeological evidence, material culture, and economic data to produce a more nuanced understanding of societal structures, demographic shifts, and institutional continuity. Excavations of urban centers, rural settlements, and ecclesiastical sites have revealed patterns of habitation, trade, and labor that complement textual records, challenging earlier assumptions of abrupt change or societal collapse. Historiographical debates have reconsidered the effects of major crises such as the Black Death, the Peasants' Revolt, and the Wars of the Roses. Early interpretations often stressed catastrophe and social upheaval, portraying medieval society as fragile and prone to collapse. Subsequent analysis, informed by manorial records, tax rolls, and archaeological surveys, demonstrates that while these events generated disruption, institutions, legal, fiscal, and administrative, adapted rather than failed. This revision highlights the resilience of medieval structures, emphasizing continuity and systemic response rather than episodic narrative alone. Archaeological evidence has contributed significantly to this reinterpretation. Surveys of abandoned villages, urban excavations, and mass burial sites provide concrete data on demographic change, settlement patterns, and economic adaptation. Material culture, including pottery, tools, and coinage, illustrates gradual evolution in daily life, trade networks, and social practice, supporting a view of medieval England as dynamic yet institutionally coherent. These findings have prompted historians to reevaluate assumptions derived solely from textual sources, integrating multiple strands of evidence to produce a balanced analysis. Economic historiography has similarly evolved, emphasizing systemic factors over elite-centric narratives. Analysis of manorial accounts, trade records, and wage data reveals that labor markets, taxation, and urban economies were responsive to both demographic pressures and institutional regulation. This approach clarifies the mechanisms by which society absorbed shocks, adjusted obligations, and maintained continuity, providing a framework to understand long-term structural change rather than episodic disruption. Political interpretation has also been reframed. Dynastic conflict, parliamentary development, and the evolution of kingship are now analyzed in relation to administrative capacity, fiscal structures, and elite negotiation, rather than purely through narrative of battles and succession. Legal codification, bureaucratic reform, and parliamentary practice demonstrate the incremental consolidation of governance that laid the groundwork for Tudor authority, emphasizing process over dramatic rupture. This synthesis of evidence highlights the provisional nature of historical understanding. Interpretations remain contingent on available sources, analytical frameworks, and methodological approaches. New discoveries, from urban excavations to reassessment of documentary evidence, continue to refine and sometimes challenge established narratives, underscoring that medieval England is best understood through an evidence-driven, critically engaged, and systematically comparative approach. Grounded academic conclusion. Before we continue exploring history in depth, hit the subscribe button and click the bell icon to receive daily Nightfall history videos. Share your thoughts in the comments. What period or event in medieval England fascinated you most? Your engagement helps guide future deep dives into the past.